Picture a Tuesday evening in November, a year when everything still seemed possible. Munich, 1923. A beer hall so vast you could fit a cathedral inside it. The Bürgerbräukeller. 3,000 people shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same thick air, cigarette smoke hanging in layers under the gas lamps like low clouds before a storm. At the front of the room, a Bavarian politician named Gustav von Kahr is giving a speech about the desperate state of Germany. It is, by all accounts, a deeply forgettable speech. The kind of speech delivered by a forgettable man during a year that seemed full of nothing but crises without solutions. The audience shifts in their seats. Beer steins clink. Somewhere near the back, a small group of men in brown uniforms are watching the exits. Then the doors burst open. 600 armed men pour into the hall. A machine gun is set up in the aisle. A figure in a rumpled brown coat shoves through the crowd, stands on a chair, fires a pistol into the ceiling, and screams into the ringing silence that follows. "The national revolution has begun," he says. The hall is surrounded. Nobody leaves. The Bavarian government has fallen. Germany is about to be reborn. His name is Adolf Hitler. He is 34 years old. He is the leader of a party that most of Germany has never heard of. He has no army, no government, no international support, no plan beyond this room. And within 24 hours, 16 of his followers will be dead in the street. His coup attempt will have collapsed in a chaos of gunfire and confusion, and he himself will be lying on the floor of a farmhouse outside Munich, nursing a dislocated shoulder, waiting to be arrested. But here is the thing about the Beer Hall Putsch of November 1923 that history almost always gets wrong when it reduces the story to a punchline about a failed coup by a lunatic French. This was not the end of something. This was not the moment Adolf Hitler was exposed and discredited and finally put in his place. This was the beginning. Everything that came before it was prelude. Everything that came after it, the trials, the book, the propaganda machine, the elections, the backroom deals, the torchlit parades, the laws stripping people of their citizenship, the cattle cars, the camps, all of it flows from the energy that was in that beer hall on that November night. The coup failed. The movement did not. And this documentary exists to answer the question that makes all of this so difficult to sit with. Not how did Hitler do it, but how did Germany let him? How did a modern, educated, culturally sophisticated nation, the nation of Beethoven, of Goethe, of Kant, the nation that had given the world some of the finest scientific minds of the preceding century, how did that nation hand the keys of its government to a movement that had been broadcasting its intentions to murder millions of people from the very beginning? How did democracy, real democracy, with real elections and real courts and real newspapers, produce this? The answer to that question is not simple. It is not flattering, and it is not safely confined to Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. It is a story about what happens to democratic societies under extreme pressure, about what ordinary people are capable of when their world becomes unrecognizable, about the specific, identifiable, replicable mechanisms by which a political movement built on hatred and lies can take hold in a country that thought it was too sophisticated for any such thing. It is, in other words, the most important political story of the 20th century. And it starts not in a beer hall in 1923, but in a hospital bed in 1918. It starts, like so many catastrophes, with something that was supposed to be the end of the worst thing that had ever happened, and turned out instead to be the beginning of something worse. The hospital was in Payswalk, a small Prussian town northeast of Berlin. October 1918. A young soldier lay in one of the wards with his eyes bandaged, temporarily blinded by a British mustard gas attack near the Belgian town of Ypres. He had been decorated twice for bravery. He had served 4 years on the Western Front as a dispatch runner, one of the most dangerous auxiliary jobs in the war, carrying messages through zones of active artillery fire between regimental headquarters and the front lines. He had survived things that had killed hundreds of thousands of his comrades. He had survived the Somme. He had survived gas. He had survived the relentless, grinding, industrial-scale slaughter that was the defining experience of young European men between 1914 and 1918. And now, Lying in that hospital bed with his eyes wrapped in gauze, he heard the news that Germany had surrendered. The armistice was signed. The Kaiser had abdicated. The war was over. He wept, not from relief, from something else, something that would not leave him for the rest of his life. His name was Adolf Hitler. He was 29 years old. He was a corporal in the German army, technically a Gefreiter, a rank that in the British system would be called Lance Corporal. Austrian-born, stateless in a practical sense, with no formal education beyond secondary school, no career, no property, no family, no plan for a life beyond the war that had just ended. He was nothing. By any conventional measure of a man standing in the world, he was nothing. And in that hospital bed, he made a decision that would cost the world 50 million lives. He decided he was going into politics. To understand why that decision, made by that particular man in that particular moment, led where it did, you have to understand what Germany looked like in November 1918. You have to understand the specific texture of the despair, the humiliation, the disorientation that settled over the country when the war ended. Because the Germany Adolf Hitler entered as a political figure was not the Germany of the Kaiser's confident, expansionist 1914. It was something else entirely. It was a country in shock. A country that had been told for 4 years by its government and its military leadership that it was winning, that victory was inevitable, that the sacrifice was worth it, and then woke up one morning in November to discover that it had lost. That it had not just lost, but collapsed. That the Kaiser had fled. That revolution was in the streets. That everything was different now, and nobody had adequately explained to the people that this was coming. The soldiers who had spent years in the trenches came home to this. Men who had watched their friends die in the mud of the Somme, men who had inhaled gas and bled from artillery wounds, and endured conditions of physical misery that modern people can barely imagine, came home to soup kitchens and bread lines, and a government nobody recognized being asked to sign a peace treaty that the new government had not negotiated and that most Germans had not had any voice in shaping. That treaty was signed in June 1919 in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. The Germans were not invited to the peace conference. They were summoned to Versailles, handed the document, and told to sign it or face resumed military action. The terms were crushing. Germany lost 13% of its territory. It lost Alsace-Lorraine to France, Eupen and Malmedy to Belgium, substantial territories in the east to the newly created state of Poland. It lost all of its overseas colonies. Its army was reduced to 100,000 men. Its navy was gutted. It was forbidden from having an air force. It was required to accept sole responsibility for the war through Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, and to pay reparations that were eventually fixed by the Allied Reparations Commission in 1921 at 132 billion gold marks, an amount equivalent to roughly 33 billion US dollars at that time, a sum so vast that serious economists immediately calculated it could not possibly be paid without destroying both the German economy and the broader European economic order. John Maynard Keynes, one of the finest economic minds of the century, attended the Versailles Peace Conference as a British Treasury official, resigned from his position in protest when he saw what was being agreed to, and published a devastating analysis in December 1919 called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, in which he argued that the reparations terms would make economic recovery impossible for Germany, would destabilize the European economy, and would plant the seeds of another war. Within a generation. He was right about every point. He was largely ignored. To German civilians, Versailles was not merely a harsh treaty. It was a betrayal. It was proof of something they had been told, by right-wing agitators, by military officers who could not face what they had actually done, by nationalist politicians who needed someone to blame, that Germany had not truly been defeated on the battlefield. The army had never broken. The soldiers had never stopped fighting. Germany had been stabbed in the back. By Jews. By socialists. By the November criminals. The politicians who had signed the armistice on November 11th, 1918. The men who had, as the story went, destroyed Germany from within, just as she was on the verge of reversing the war's tide. This was a lie. It was a carefully constructed, politically motivated lie with no basis in military reality. By the autumn of 1918, Germany's military position was genuinely desperate. The spring offensives had burned through Germany's last strategic reserves. American troops were arriving on the Western Front at a rate of 250,000 per month. The British Empire's industrial and manpower capacity, combined with American entry into the war, had created a material superiority that Germany had no realistic prospect of overcoming. General Erich Ludendorff, the same Ludendorff who would later march beside Hitler in the streets of Munich, and who became one of the most prominent propagandists of the stab-in-the-back mythology, had himself told the Kaiser in September 1918 that the war was lost and that Germany must seek an armistice as quickly as possible. But the myth spread because it was needed. Germany needed an explanation that did not require its people to accept that their government had lied to them for 4 years about who was winning, that their leaders had miscalculated catastrophically, that the sacrifice of 2 million dead German soldiers had been squandered through strategic incompetence at the highest levels of command. The stab-in-the-back myth offered an alternative. We were winning. We would have won. Someone took it from us. And that story found an enormous, grieving, furious, receptive audience in a country that desperately needed to believe it. Adolf Hitler was the most effective instrument that story ever found. He believed it with a totality and a ferocity that made his advocacy of it feel viscerally real to the audiences who heard him. And he came to it not as a political calculation, but as a genuine conviction forged in that hospital bed in Pasewalk, in the specific, personal grief of a man who had given the war everything he had and could not accept that the cause he had served was simply defeated. Before we follow him into politics, we need to know who he was, because understanding where he came from is part of understanding how he got to where he was going. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small Austrian market town on the Inn River, at the crossing point between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German state of Bavaria. His father, Alois Hitler, was a customs official, a bureaucrat of some local standing, stern and authoritarian in the way of men who have worked hard to achieve respectability from humble origins. Alois had been born illegitimate, had taken the surname Hitler from his stepfather, and had risen through the customs service through diligence and competence. He expected his children to follow him into the civil service. Adolf had other ideas, which is about as diplomatically as the historical record allows you to describe the constant, grinding conflict between the two of them. His mother, Clara, was the third of Alois's wives, 23 years younger than her husband, gentle and devoted to her children with the particular intensity of a woman who had watched 2 of them die in infancy before Adolf survived. She loved him with an unguarded fierceness that he reciprocated. Her death from breast cancer in December 1907, when Hitler was 18, was one of the defining griefs of his life. Her doctor, who came to the Hitler home repeatedly during her final illness and treated both her and her son with genuine kindness, was a Jewish physician named Eduard Bloch. Hitler expressed genuine gratitude to Bloch. Years later, when Nazi Germany absorbed Austria and Jews across the country were being subjected to systematic persecution, Hitler would ensure that Bloch and his wife were protected, given a status that allowed them to emigrate safely to the United States. It is one of the biographical details that complicated any portrait of Hitler as a simple, consistent, lifelong anti-Semite, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we continue, because it reminds us that what he became was not what he always was. It was something he chose, something that was built. After his mother's death, Hitler went to Vienna. He had already been rejected once by the Academy of Fine Arts. His portfolio showed adequate technical ability in architecture and landscapes, but insufficient skill in figure drawing. He tried again in 1908 and was rejected again. He drifted. He spent his inheritance. By 1909, he was in genuine poverty, living in a men's homeless shelter, wearing donated clothes, surviving by selling small watercolor paintings of Viennese landmarks to souvenir shops and tourist cafes. He read constantly political pamphlets, racial theory tracts, anti-Semitic newspapers, popular history. anything he could get his hands on in the reading rooms of Vienna's public libraries, which were free and warm. Vienna was a city of extraordinary cultural vitality and extraordinary political toxicity. It was the capital of a creaking multinational empire, German, Czech, Hungarian, Slavic, Jewish, all compressed together in one place. And it had developed, as multicultural cities under pressure often do, a particularly virulent strain of ethnic politics. The city's mayor, Karl Lueger, had built a powerful political machine on populist anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitic press was a flourishing industry. Theories about racial hierarchy and the Jewish threat to European civilization circulated in pamphlets and books and lectures with an openness that would have been unusual in Western Europe, but was unremarkable in Vienna. Hitler absorbed all of this. But even in Vienna, even in his most difficult years, even while reading the anti-Semitic press and the racial theorists, he was not yet the ideological fanatic he would become. He had Jewish acquaintances and business associates. He did not make his anti-Semitism his primary social identity. Historians who have studied this period carefully, particularly Ian Kershaw, whose 2-volume biography of Hitler remains the standard, argue that the full crystallization of Hitler's eliminationist anti-Semitism, the leap from prejudice and cultural resentment to the conviction that Jews must be physically destroyed for Germany to survive, came not from Vienna, but from the war, from the defeat, from the specific psychological wound that November 1918 inflicted on a man who had invested everything in a cause that had collapsed. He left Vienna in May 1913 and moved to Munich, which felt more genuinely German to him, less cosmopolitan, less multi-ethnic, more aligned with the pan-German nationalism he had been absorbing for years. When the war began in August 1914, he was among the thousands who rushed to volunteer. He enlisted in a Bavarian regiment, serving as a dispatch runner for 4 years, decorated twice for bravery. The Iron Cross Second Class in December 1914, the Iron Cross First Class in August 1918, never rising above the rank of Lance Corporal, but accumulating, in those 4 years of trenches and gas and artillery, a sense of purpose and belonging and meaning that he had never found in civilian life. The war was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and then it ended, and he was in a hospital bed with bandaged eyes, and everything was gone. He returned to Munich. He remained in the army for as long as he possibly could, because the army was his home. It fed him, housed him, gave him identity. In the summer of 1919, the army gave him a job that would change the history of the world. He was assigned as a Verbindungsmann, an intelligence agent, tasked with attending meetings of the various nationalist and radical groups proliferating in Munich's beer halls and reporting on their activities. The political landscape of Munich in 1919 was a jungle of small movements, veterans organizations, secret societies, anti-Semitic leagues, and agitational clubs, all competing for the loyalty of men who had come home from the war to a republic they despised. On September 12, 1919, fulfilling his intelligence duties, Hitler attended a small meeting of an organization called the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, the German Workers' Party, held in a back room of the Sterneckerbrau Beer Hall. There were perhaps 40 people present. The meeting was unremarkable in almost every way. Then a man in the audience began arguing that Bavaria should separate from Germany and join Austria. And something in Hitler ignited. He stood up without being called upon, spoke for 15 minutes without preparation, and demolished the man's argument with a ferocity and a fluency that left the room in stunned silence. Anton Drexler, the party's founder, watched from the side. He was a Munich locksmith, quiet, earnest, genuinely devoted to the idea of creating a nationalist movement that could reach the working class without resorting to Marxism. He had spent years trying to find the right formula and the right voice. When he watched Hitler speak that evening, he knew he had found both. At the end of the meeting, he pressed a copy of his pamphlet into Hitler's hands. A few days later, Hitler received a postcard. His application to the German Workers' Party had been accepted. He had not applied. Drexler had submitted him, but he went to the next meeting, and then the one after that. And within weeks, the party had changed beyond recognition, because the party had found the thing it had been missing, a man who could make people feel in their blood and their bones, everything the party believed. The German Workers' Party had fewer than 60 members when Hitler joined. By the spring of 1920, he was drawing audiences of 2,000 to hear him speak. The growth was not gradual. It was explosive. Word spread through Munich's nationalist networks. "There's a man you have to hear." People came once out of curiosity. They came back because they had never heard anything like it. And they brought friends. What Hitler did in those early speeches was something that distinguished him absolutely from every other political speaker in Germany at the time. He did not explain. He did not argue. He did not present platforms or policies or programs. He performed. He performed the collective emotional life of a traumatized nation back at the audience that was living it. He stood at the front of those smoky beer halls, and he took the rage and the humiliation and the grief and the confusion that were poisoning the air of post-war Germany, and he gave those feelings shape, gave them a story, gave them a villain, gave them a destiny. He told audiences that their suffering was not random, that it was not the result of historical forces beyond anyone's control, that it was the deliberate work of specific, identifiable enemies who could be confronted, defeated, punished. He named those enemies clearly: the Jews, the Marxists, the November criminals, the men who had signed Versailles. And he promised, with an absolute sincerity that audiences found overwhelming, that one day Germany would be free of them, that Germany would rise again, that the betrayal would be avenged. The technique he had developed was not accidental. He had studied it empirically, attending other speakers' meetings, noting what worked and what fell flat, adjusting, refining, trying again. He understood the physical environment of a large beer hall, the way the noise and the warmth and the press of bodies created a specific emotional register, a receptivity to collective feeling that a quiet lecture room never achieved. He used silence the way a skilled musician uses rests, building anticipation before the key phrase, letting the audience lean forward before he gave them what they were waiting for. He began each speech quietly, almost conversationally, establishing facts and grievances with a calm that seemed almost judicial, then built the intensity gradually, the voice rising and the arms moving and the eyes fixing on some point above the audience's heads, until the whole room was locked in with him, breathing in rhythm. And then the burst, the final condemnation, the cry for justice, the moment where the audience erupted and Hitler stood there at the center of it, absorbing the energy, feeding on it, sending it back amplified. It was extraordinary, and it was genuine. The emotions he expressed in those speeches were his own emotions. He was not cynically manufacturing feeling he did not possess. He felt all of it: the rage, the conviction, the sense of personal and national mission. And that genuineness was what made it impossible to counter with ordinary political argument. How do you debate a man who is not making arguments? How do you refute a man who is not presenting evidence? On February 24th, 1920, Hitler stood before 2,000 people at the Hofbrauhaus, Munich's most famous beer hall, a cavernous, low-ceilinged room that smelled of beer and sawdust and a century of political argument, and announced both a new name for the party and a program for Germany's future. The Deutsche Arbeiterpartei was now the National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, National Socialist German Workers' Party, STAP. The name had 25 points of program attached to it, a document that Hitler had co-written with Drexler and with the economist Gottfried Feder. Some of the points were economic, profit-sharing in large industries, nationalization of trusts, land reform, abolition of income without labor. Some were nationalist, rejection of Versailles, unification of all German speakers in a greater Germany, demand for colonies. And some were the specific poison that distinguished this party from every other nationalist group in Germany: Jews to be excluded from German citizenship. Full stop. Jewish immigration to be halted. Jews who had arrived after 1914 to be expelled. Only those of German blood could belong to the German nation. The anti-Semitism was not a side note. It was not one item in a list of 25. It was the organizing principle from which everything else derived meaning. In Hitler's framework, the stab in the back had been a Jewish operation. The Marxism corroding Germany from within was a Jewish creation. International finance capitalism, which was bleeding Germany through reparations, was Jewish. The press that misled the German people was controlled by Jews. The cultural decadence that was weakening German society was promoted by Jews. Every crisis, every failure, every humiliation, every betrayal had the same author. Once you accepted that framework, everything else followed with a terrible, self-reinforcing logic. The party adopted a symbol that August, a swastika, a hook cross that had appeared in various ancient cultures, but that the Nazis now made entirely their own, against a white circle on a red background. The red for the social vision of the movement, the white for the nationalist ideal, the black swastika for the struggle for the victory of the Aryan race. Hitler claimed to have designed the flag himself. Whatever its precise origins, it was a masterstroke of graphic politics, striking, distinctive, visible from a distance, impossible to misread. You saw that flag and you knew immediately what it stood for, what side it was on, what future it promised. The party acquired a newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, the People's Observer, purchased with funds from nationalist sympathizers and from elements within the Reichswehr, the new German army. It acquired an address, a small office in Munich that served as headquarters. It acquired, in October 1921, a paramilitary force, the Sturmabteilung, the Storm Detachment, the SA, the Brown Shirts. The men who wore the brown shirts, a color chosen partly because a large stock of colonial uniform shirts was cheaply available after the war, were veterans and Free Corps fighters, men who had learned in the trenches that violence was an effective political tool and who brought that lesson into the politics of the Republic. Their job was to protect Nazi meetings and disrupt everyone else's, to beat communists in the streets, to turn up at opposition rallies and create chaos, to demonstrate through physical presence and readiness to fight that the Nazi movement was not to be trifled with. And Hitler had, by July 1921, made himself absolute master of all of it. When the party's committee tried to negotiate a merger with another nationalist organization without his knowledge while he was in Berlin, he returned and threatened to resign. The committee knew what that meant. He was the only thing that filled those halls. He was the only reason the subscriptions came in and the crowds kept growing. They capitulated entirely. He was given the title of Vorsitzender, chairman, with authority that was, in practice, dictatorial. The Führerprinzip, the leadership principle, one man at the top with unquestioned authority flowing downward, was now the organizing structure of the movement. He was 32 years old. He had transformed, in less than 2 years, from an unknown intelligence informant attending boring meetings of obscure organizations to the undisputed, absolute leader of the most dangerous political movement in Bavaria. He wanted more. He wanted Germany. And then Germany gave him, in 1923, what felt like his moment. The crisis of 1923 was rooted in the reparations imposed by Versailles. Germany had been struggling to meet the payment schedule from the beginning. It was not simply that the German government was deliberately evading, though there was certainly some of that, but that the scale of what was demanded was genuinely beyond what the German economy could sustain. In 1922, Germany defaulted on timber deliveries. In January 1923, France and Belgium made a decision that seemed, at the time, like a reasonable response to a recalcitrant debtor, but was, in practice, an act of catastrophic geopolitical miscalculation. They sent 60,000 troops into the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr was Germany's industrial heartland. Coal mines, steel mills, railway junctions, the industrial infrastructure that produced the goods Germany needed to pay reparations in the first place. The French and Belgian troops were there to take control of that infrastructure directly, to extract what they believed Germany owed them. The German government responded with what it called passive resistance, urging workers to strike, to refuse cooperation with the occupying forces, to shut the factories and the mines. And it agreed to pay the striking workers. With money it did not have. With money it printed. What followed was not inflation. Inflation was a word that did not come close to capturing what happened to Germany's currency in 1923. What happened was the complete and total obliteration of the mark as a meaningful unit of exchange. In January 1923, one American dollar bought 17,000 marks, already a catastrophic debasement from the pre-war rate of 4 marks to the dollar. But January was merely the beginning. By May, the dollar was worth 47,000 marks. By July, 350,000. By September, 98 million. By November, the nightmare month, the apex of the madness, $1 was worth 4 trillion, 200 billion marks. Let that settle. 4 trillion, 200 billion marks to $1. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January cost 200 billion marks by November. A postage stamp, a glass of beer, a tram ticket. Every ordinary transaction of ordinary life required quantities of money so vast that the numbers stopped having meaning. Workers were paid twice daily, in the morning and the afternoon, because if they waited until the end of the day, their wages had lost significant purchasing power. Families sent children to the markets immediately after the morning pay, because prices rose by the hour. Women were photographed wheeling barrows of banknotes to buy groceries. People burned stacks of money in their furnaces because it was cheaper than the firewood it could buy. Children played with bricks of worthless currency in the streets. And underneath the absurdist theater of those images was something far darker and more lasting: the total destruction of everything the German middle class had saved, worked for, and believed in. The people most devastated by hyperinflation were not the very wealthy. They had property, gold, foreign currency, real assets that held value when paper became worthless. And they were not the very poor, who had never trusted institutions with their money and who had little to lose. The people destroyed were the careful, responsible, institution-trusting German middle class. The shopkeepers and the teachers and the civil servants and the small investors who had done what the state asked, who had bought war bonds in 1914, who had put money in savings accounts, who had planned patiently for retirement, and who found, in the autumn of 1923, that everything they had saved was worth less than a single transit fare. These were the people who would not forget. These were the people who would not, when the next crisis came, be inclined to give the Republic the benefit of the doubt. And these were the people who would, in astonishing numbers, eventually vote for Adolf Hitler. But that was still years away. In the autumn of 1923, the crisis presented what looked like an immediate opportunity. The Republic seemed to be dissolving. The currency was worthless. Communists were agitating in Saxony. Separatists were talking in Bavaria. The Weimar government in Berlin looked helpless. And Hitler, watching all of this from Munich, began making plans for something much more ambitious than speeches in beer halls. He had been studying Mussolini. In October 1922, the Italian fascist leader had organized a march on Rome, a mass mobilization of black-shirt paramilitaries that had essentially intimidated the Italian government into handing him the prime ministership. Mussolini had not actually marched. He had traveled to Rome comfortably by sleeper train while his followers converged on the capital. But the theatrics of it were magnificent, and the result was real. A bold enough gesture, backed by enough men, directed at a weak enough government, could succeed. Hitler was convinced of it. Bavaria in 1923 was governed by a right-wing triumvirate. State Commissioner Gustav von Kahr, with effectively dictatorial powers, General Otto von Lossow, commanding the Bavarian military forces, and Police Chief Hans von Caesar. All three men despised the Weimar government in Berlin. All three wanted to see it overthrown. But they were cautious men, establishment conservatives, who believed in working through institutional channels, even when they were bending those channels significantly. They were not ready to commit to a putsch. Hitler believed he could force their hand. On the evening of November 8, 1923, the three men were at the Berger Braukeller, addressing a gathering of Munich's civic establishment. Hitler burst in with 600 armed SA men surrounding the building. He fired his pistol into the ceiling. He announced the revolution. He hustled Kahr, Lossow, and Caesar into a back room at gunpoint and demanded their support. General Erich Ludendorff, World War I's most famous military commander, now attached to the nationalist cause, was brought in to lend the enterprise the weight of his military reputation. Under pressure, with guns in the room, all three men gave vague assurances of support. Hitler went back to the main hall and delivered one of the most electrifying speeches of his life. The crowd, which had entered in terror and confusion, left cheering. For a few hours, it seemed as though the putsch might actually work. Then Carr, Loso, and Caesar were released. And once they were out of Hitler's physical presence, out of that room with the guns, they immediately began working to suppress the coup. Carr issued proclamations. Loso ordered the army to hold firm. Caesar organized the police. By morning, it was clear that no one of any institutional weight was coming to Hitler's side. The next morning, November 9th, the anniversary of the Kaiser's abdication, Hitler and Ludendorff made a desperate decision. They would march. They would take to the streets with 2,000 armed men and march toward the center of Munich. And somehow, through sheer momentum, through the spectacle of the thing, they would force the situation to break in their favor. At the Odeonsplatz, in front of the Feldherrnhall, the Field Marshal's Hall, Munich's monument to Bavarian military glory, they found the road blocked by a cordon of state police. There was a moment of absolute stillness. Then shots were fired. Nobody has ever definitively established who shot first. In the chaos that followed, 16 Nazi marchers and 4 policemen lay dead or dying on the pavement. Hitler, marching at the front, was pulled or fell to the ground when the man beside him, Max Erwin von Stubenrichter, was shot dead and collapsed, wrenching Hitler's arm as he fell and dislocating his shoulder. Hitler was bundled into a waiting car and driven out of Munich. He was arrested 2 days later, hiding at the farmhouse of his friend Ernst Hafstengel outside the city. The Beer Hall Putsch was over. 20 people were dead. The Nazi Party was banned. Its headquarters were shuttered. Hitler was charged with high treason. To every rational observer, in November 1923, this was the end. A fringe agitator, leading a fringe movement, had attempted a coup that failed in 24 hours. He was going to prison. The movement was gone. Germany could move on. They were wrong. The Beer Hall Putsch was not the end of the Nazi movement. It was, in a very precise sense, the moment it became real. Because Adolf Hitler's trial, held in February and March of 1924, was the first time the entire country knew his name. The trial was a showcase, and Hitler understood it immediately. The sympathetic Bavarian judges gave him extraordinary latitude to speak, to turn the courtroom into a platform, to deliver extended speeches about Germany's betrayal, about the honor of the men who had marched, about the duty of Germans to resist the republic that had humiliated their nation. He addressed the court with absolute composure and absolute confidence. He accepted personal responsibility for the putsch not as a confession of wrongdoing, but as a declaration of honor. Yes, I tried to overthrow a government that deserved to be overthrown, and I would do it again. He told the judges that history would vindicate him. He was so compelling, so clearly sincere in his conviction, that even people who had no sympathy with his politics found themselves wondering whether he might actually be right. He was found guilty of high treason and sentenced to 5 years at Landsberg prison. He served 8 months. In those 8 months, Adolf Hitler dictated a book. Rudolf Hess, his loyal deputy, typed as Hitler spoke, and what emerged was a document that should have been read much more carefully by the people who would later claim they had not known what was coming. The book was called Mein Kampf, My Struggle, originally planned under the title 4.5 years of struggle against lies, stupidity, and cowardice, a title his publisher wisely convinced him to change. Mein Kampf was not easy to read. By any literary standard, it was a laborious, repetitive, grammatically imprecise work that sprawled for nearly 700 pages and required considerable patience from anyone who attempted it. Critics at the time mocked its style. Most people who bought it in the first years after its publication. Volume 1 appeared in July 1925, Volume 2 in 1926, did not read it carefully or at all. The initial print run was modest. Sales were decent but not remarkable. But anyone who did read it carefully knew, with complete precision, what Adolf Hitler intended. Because he told them. The anti-Semitism in Mein Kampf was not a political position. It was a cosmology. Hitler described the Jews as a biological threat to all human civilization, not as a religious group, not as a cultural community, not even as a racial group in the ordinary sense, but as something closer to a virus, a parasite that infected healthy host nations, drained their vitality, corrupted their culture, undermined their institutions, and eventually destroyed them. He described the history of the world as a conflict between the creative Aryan race, of which Germans were the highest representatives, and the destructive Jewish force that sought to corrupt and destroy all Aryan achievement. The stakes, in his telling, were not political. They were existential. It was either the Jews or the Aryan race. There was no coexistence possible. There was no negotiated settlement. There was only victory or annihilation. He wrote about Lebensraum, living space. Germany needed territory. Specifically, German territory in the East, in Russia, in Eastern Europe, that could support a growing German population with agricultural land and natural resources. This territory was currently occupied by Slavic peoples whom Hitler regarded as racially inferior and historically inconsequential. The solution was German colonization, which implied the displacement or destruction of whoever was in the way. He was not vague about this. He named Russia explicitly as the primary target. He connected it directly to his anti-Semitism by describing the Soviet state as a Jewish state, a Bolshevik creation designed by Jews to destroy Russia's Aryan civilization and turn it into a weapon against Germany. He wrote about propaganda, what it was, how it worked, how it should be deployed. He was contemptuous of any propaganda that relied on complexity or nuance. The masses, he wrote, do not think with their heads. They respond to emotion, to repetition, to simple formulas that confirm their feelings. Effective propaganda had to be massive, simple, emotionally direct, and absolutely consistent. It had to identify enemies clearly and never waver in that identification. It had to repeat the same messages so many times that they became reflex. He wrote about democracy with contempt so profound that it reached something close to aesthetic disgust. Parliamentary government was designed by Jews to prevent strong leadership. It was a mechanism for mediocrity. It produced governments by committee, governments by consensus, governments that could not act decisively because they required the agreement of too many people with too many conflicting interests. Germany needed a Führer, one leader with absolute authority, responsible only to history and to the German people in a mystical sense, unconstrained by the votes of parliament or the rulings of courts. He published all of this in a book. He sold it in bookshops. He gave interviews about it. He spoke about it on stages across Germany. There was nothing hidden about what he intended. The question that haunts the history of this period is not how no one knew. They knew. The question is why, knowing, so many people chose to dismiss it as rhetoric, chose to tell themselves he did not mean it, chose to calculate that the benefits of using his political energy outweighed the risks of what he was openly planning to do with power. He walked out of Landsberg prison in December 1924 into a Germany that looked, on the surface, calmer. The hyperinflation had been ended by the introduction of a new currency, the Rentenmark, backed by Germany's land values rather than government promises, and by the Dawes Plan of 1924, an American-brokered rescheduling of the reparations that provided Germany with substantial loans and reduced the immediate payment burden. The French and Belgian forces had withdrawn from the Ruhr. A new chancellor, Gustav Stresemann, was pursuing a policy of international engagement, signing treaties, and working Germany back into the community of nations. The Republic, which had seemed to be dissolving in 1923, had survived. In this more settled atmosphere, the Nazi Party was irrelevant. It had been banned during Hitler's imprisonment and had fragmented into competing factions. The nationalist right was split among a dozen organizations. In the Reichstag elections of May 1928, the reconstituted NSDAP won 2.6% of the national vote, 12 seats in a parliament of 491. The Social Democrats had won nearly 30%. The Catholic Center 12%. The Communists 11%. By any reasonable calculation, the Nazi Party was a marginal phenomenon, a regional Bavarian curiosity with no national future. Then October 1929 arrived, and in a single week, everything changed again. The Wall Street crash of October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, Black Tuesday, the week the American financial system began its collapse, was not merely an American event. It was a global event whose effects on Germany were specifically devastating because Germany's economic recovery since 1924 had been built substantially on American loans. When American banks needed their capital back, those loans were called in. German banks began to fail. German businesses, unable to refinance their debts, began to contract or collapse. The unemployment rate, which had been declining through the mid-1920s, reversed course with a speed that left policymakers stunned. In the first 3 months of 1930, 3.3 million Germans were officially registered as unemployed. A year later, nearly 5 million. By early 1932, more than 6 million, roughly 30% of the workforce. By the winter of that year, estimates suggest that more than 40% of all German workers were unemployed or working drastically reduced hours. 6 million officially unemployed in a country of 65 million people, in an era before comprehensive social welfare systems, in a political climate already poisoned by resentment and conspiracy theory, and the specific memory of the hyperinflation that had destroyed the middle class's savings less than a decade before. The human reality behind those numbers was men standing for hours in bread lines in the January cold, families selling furniture to buy food, children going to school hungry, veterans who had survived the Western Front now unable to feed their children in the cities they had come home to celebrate. The Weimar Republic, which had never commanded the deep effective loyalty of its citizens, born in defeat, associated with humiliation, burdened from its first year by the weight of Versailles, was now presiding over a catastrophe it could not fix, and its inability to fix it was being experienced by millions of desperate people, as proof of everything the Nazi movement had been saying about parliamentary government for a decade. The September 1930 Reichstag elections delivered the verdict. The Nazi Party won 18.3% of the vote, 107 seats, from 12 seats to 107 in 28 months, from 800,000 votes to 6.4 million. Every political observer in Germany, and many watching from outside, was genuinely stunned. This was not a protest vote, or not only a protest vote. This was a movement. And this is where part one of our story ends. Not with a triumph for the Nazis. They still had less than a fifth of the vote, but with the collapse of the political conditions that had kept them marginal. The Depression had done what the hyperinflation had begun. It had shattered the faith of the German middle class and the institutions that were supposed to protect them. And into that shattered faith, the Nazi Party was pouring, every day, every rally, every newspaper article, every speech, the same message, the same enemies, the same promise, the same absolute certainty, delivered at the top of a man's voice, that things could be different, that Germany could be great again, that the people who had done this to Germany would answer for it. 6 million people had believed that enough to vote for it in September 1930. By July 1932, that number would be 13 million. And between those elections and January 30th, 1933, the morning Hindenburg swore Hitler in as chancellor, lay a political story of breathtaking, terrifying speed. A story of how democracies fail, how institutions meant to hold firm bend and buckle under pressure, how intelligent men make catastrophically wrong calculations about who they can control. That story is where we go in part 2. But before we go there, we need to sit with the Germany of the late 1920s for a moment. Not the crisis Germany, not the desperate Germany of 1923 or 1932, but the Germany that existed in the years between. The Germany that was, briefly, genuinely recovering. Because understanding that Germany, and why it was not enough, is essential to understanding everything that followed. The mid-1920s in Germany were, by any objective measure, a period of genuine progress. The stabilization of the currency in late 1923 and the Dawes Plan of 1924 gave the economy a foundation to rebuild on. American investment flowed in. Factories reopened. Employment rose. The arts and culture of Weimar Germany achieved something extraordinary. Berlin in the late 1920s was one of the most creatively vital cities in the world. Its cabarets and theaters and film studios and publishers producing work of genuine brilliance and daring. The Bauhaus was redesigning the relationship between art and industry. Fritz Lang was making films that reimagined what cinema could do. Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill were creating theater that cut to the bone of political reality. Scientists and philosophers and writers of the first rank were working in German universities and research institutes. And politically, the Republic was functioning. Imperfectly, coalition governments formed and dissolved with disorienting frequency, and the proportional representation system made stable parliamentary majorities almost impossible, but functioning. Elections were held, and their results were respected. Courts operated with some genuine independence. The press was free, and it was used. Civil society was active and organized and loud. The problem was that none of this had produced what the Republic most needed: genuine popular legitimacy. The Weimar Republic had been born in defeat and associated from its first breath with the humiliation of Versailles. The men who signed the armistice were called criminals. The men who signed the peace treaty were called traitors. The Republic itself was seen by large segments of the German population, not just the radical right, but substantial parts of the conservative mainstream, as a temporary arrangement, an embarrassing necessity, something that might eventually be replaced by something more in keeping with German tradition. Whatever that meant, this lack of deep legitimacy was the Republic's most fundamental vulnerability. Institutions can absorb political and economic shocks if the population believes in them. If a large percentage of the population believes that the institutions are illegitimate, that the people running them are traitors or fools, that a different system would be better, then those institutions are fragile in a way that no constitutional design can fully compensate for. The Weimar Republic was fragile in exactly this way. It had enemies on both ends of the political spectrum: the communist left that wanted Soviet-style revolution, and the nationalist right that wanted a return to authoritarian governance. And it had, at its center, a democratic mainstream that believed in the Republic, but whose commitment to it had not yet been tested by anything severe enough to reveal how deep that commitment actually went. The Depression was that test. And we need to be precise about what the Depression did, politically, because the simple story that desperate people voted for Hitler misses something important. Desperate people voted for Hitler because he offered them what the established parties did not just a diagnosis of what was wrong, but an explanation of who was responsible, and a promise of what would happen to those responsible. The Social Democrats offered a program. The Center offered a coalition. The liberal parties offered responsible governance. Hitler offered justice. He offered enemies. He offered the specific emotional satisfaction of having someone to blame who was both real and identifiable and sufficiently evil to bear the weight of all that fury. The Nazis received their 18% in September 1930 not because 18% of Germans were committed anti-Semites who wanted to build death camps. Most of them had no idea what they were setting in motion. They were people who felt that the Republic had failed them, who were looking for something different, and who found in the Nazi movement the most compelling performance of urgency and certainty available in the market of German politics at that moment. They were, in many cases, not voting for what the Nazis intended. They were voting against what Germany had become, against the desperation, against the humiliation, against the sense that the established order had nothing left to offer them. This is not an excuse. There is no excuse for what happened, but it is an explanation, and explanations matter, not because they allow us to forgive, but because they allow us to recognize the same patterns when they appear in different contexts, wearing different clothes. The conditions that produced 18% for the Nazis in September 1930 are not conditions unique to Weimar Germany. They are conditions that can develop anywhere. Economic catastrophe without political response adequate to the scale of the suffering. A political mainstream too cautious, too divided, too focused on process to speak to the emotional reality of desperate people. A radical movement willing to do what the mainstream will not, to name enemies, to make promises without qualification, to offer certainty in a world of suffocating uncertainty. There are also the people who specifically enabled the Nazi rise in the years between 1930 and 1933. Not the millions of ordinary voters, but the small group of political insiders who made specific decisions that cleared the path. The men who governed by emergency decree when they should have built coalitions. The men who brought Hitler into government when they could have held him out. The men who boasted they could control him. Those men are the subject of Part 2, and their story is, in many ways, even more disturbing than the story of the Nazi movement itself, because they were not desperate, they were not deceived, they were not ignorant of what they were doing. They were intelligent, experienced political professionals who made a series of choices that, viewed together, amount to one of the most catastrophic political miscalculations in modern history. The Weimar Republic did not simply collapse under the weight of the Depression and the Nazi surge. It was also hollowed out from within by the very people who were supposed to be governing it. Beginning in March 1930, with the appointment of Heinrich Brüning as Chancellor, Germany was governed increasingly by presidential emergency decree rather than by parliamentary majority, a trend of the Nazi rise only accelerated, but that began before the Nazis were in a position to demand it. Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution had been used 16 times between 1925 and 1930. In 1931 alone, it was used 42 times. In 1932, 58 times. Germany was being governed by executive decree, bypassing the elected parliament, months before Adolf Hitler ever entered the chancellery. This matters enormously. The erosion of democratic governance in Germany was not something the Nazis did. It was something the German establishment began doing before the Nazis had enough power to demand it, and then accelerated in response to Nazi pressure, and then handed to Hitler as a ready-made instrument of dictatorship once he took office. The Enabling Act of March 1933 that gave Hitler legislative power was made possible partly by the precedents established by men who considered themselves moderate conservatives, men who thought they were managing a crisis with appropriate pragmatism, not dismantling democracy. These are the threads we follow in Part 2 of this documentary. From the elections of September 1930 to the morning of January 30th, 1933, when Paul von Hindenburg swore in Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of the German Reich. 18 months of political maneuvering, street violence, economic despair, and catastrophic miscalculation. The story of how a democracy handed over its own keys. And to fully understand that handover, we need to understand one more element that this documentary has not yet fully addressed: the role of the German military and the German aristocracy in the political landscape of the late Weimar Republic. Because these were not peripheral figures. They were central, and their specific relationship to the Nazi movement, suspicious, contemptuous, but ultimately cooperative, is one of the most illuminating aspects of the whole story. The German military in the Weimar Republic was an institution with profound ambivalence about the state it served. The Reichswehr, limited by Versailles to 100,000 men, was staffed at its upper levels by professional officers who had served in the Imperial German Army, who had grown up in a culture of military aristocracy that predated the Republic by generations, and who regarded the Weimar system with a combination of contempt and condescension. They were not Democrats. Most of them were monarchists at heart, or at least believers in strong state authority of a kind that parliamentary democracy, with its coalition governments, and its perpetual negotiations, and its elected officials who did not understand military affairs, seemed constitutionally incapable of providing. But they were also professionals, and they were cautious, and they were genuinely alarmed by the SA, by the 2 million strong paramilitary army that Rome had built, that was talking openly about absorbing the Reichswehr into a new people's military, that represented to the professional officers everything they found most distasteful about the Nazi movement: its vulgarity, its indiscipline, its subordination of military professionalism to political ideology. This gave the military a specific set of interests in the political crisis of 1932 and 1933. They wanted the Nazis in government because the Nazis were reliable anti-communists, and because Nazi electoral support could be used to rebuild German military power, including rearming in violation of Versailles. But they wanted the SA controlled, Rome marginalized, and the Reichswehr's institutional independence preserved. They were, in other words, making exactly the kind of calculation that Papen was making. They thought they could use the Nazi movement without being consumed by it. The Night of the Long Knives, on June 30th, 1934, gave them what they wanted in the most direct way imaginable. Hitler murdered Rome and the SA leadership. He solved their specific problem for them. And in return, or perhaps simply as the next step in the consolidation of his own power, he demanded and received the personal loyalty oath that every officer and soldier swore on August 2nd, 1934, the day Hindenburg died. General Werner von Blomberg, the defense minister who led the military's acceptance of the oath, convinced himself that this was a manageable exchange. Hitler had demonstrated, through the Night of the Long Knives, that he was willing to act against the radical elements of his own movement. He had shown that he could be a partner for the establishment rather than a revolutionary force that swept it away. Blomberg convinced himself and advised Hindenburg's successor, now Hitler himself, that the military would serve the state and that the new Führer would respect the military's professional independence. He was of course wrong. The oath to Hitler personally, rather than to the office of Chancellor or to the Constitution, transformed the military's relationship to political authority in ways that Blomberg did not fully appreciate at the time. An oath to the Constitution could be interpreted as an oath to the principles of legitimate governance that might, in extreme circumstances, supersede the commands of an individual leader. An oath to Hitler personally contained no such interpretive escape hatch. When officers later found themselves ordered to do things that violated their professional judgment or their personal ethics, the oath stood as a barrier to the organized resistance that might otherwise have been possible. Several individual officers did resist. The July 20th, 1944 bomb plot against Hitler is the most famous example. But they did so in explicit defiance of an oath they had sworn, and the psychological weight of oath-breaking added significantly to the moral cost they had to bear. The German aristocracy's relationship to the Nazi movement was similarly complicated. The Junkers, the landed Prussian nobility who had dominated German conservative politics for generations, were not, in the main, enthusiastic Nazis. They despised the movement's vulgarity, its plebeian energy, its assault on the class hierarchies that gave their lives structure and meaning. But they were also deeply anti-communist, deeply committed to maintaining the economic arrangements that kept their great estates intact, and deeply hostile to the social democratic left that they associated with the forces that had ended the Kaiser's empire. When Hindenburg, himself a junker of the old school, appointed Hitler in January 1933, he was acting at least partly in response to the pressure of aristocratic conservatives who calculated, as Papen had, that Hitler was the best available weapon against the left. They got a bargain they had not anticipated. Within a few years, the Junker landowners would find themselves serving a state that was less friendly to their class interests than they had expected, their political influence entirely displaced by the Nazi party apparatus, their sons commanded by men who had risen through party ranks rather than through the traditional military hierarchy. They had helped create a revolution that ate them as surely as it ate everyone else who tried to use it. The lesson from a military and the aristocracy's experience is the same lesson that Papen's experience teaches, stated from a different angle. The people who tried to use the Nazi movement as a tool discovered, uniformly, that the Nazi movement was using them. This is the invariable experience of those who attempt to manage revolutionary political movements by incorporating them into existing power structures. The revolutionary movement does not become manageable when given access to the state apparatus. It uses the state apparatus to complete the revolution it was already planning, and the people who gave it access become, at best, irrelevant, and at worst, threats to be eliminated once their utility has expired. Understanding this, truly absorbing the lesson rather than merely acknowledging it intellectually, requires confronting the limits of the kind of strategic cleverness that Papen and Hugenberg and Blomberg represented. These were not stupid men. By conventional measures, they were sophisticated operators, experienced in the complex negotiations of German political life. They failed not because they lacked intelligence, but because they applied an analytical framework, the framework of conventional political management, of give-and-take coalition building, of managing difficult partners through strategic compromise, to a situation that had already moved beyond the reach of that framework. Adolf Hitler was not a difficult coalition partner. He was a revolutionary who had been given the state apparatus and who intended to use it to complete a revolution he had been planning since 1919. Understanding this, in January 1933, required taking Mein Kampf seriously. It required believing that the man who had been telling audiences across Germany for 14 years what he intended to do with power actually intended to do it. It required setting aside the comforting assumption that no one in a position of political responsibility actually meant the most extreme things they said. The German establishment could not make itself believe it. That failure of belief, that specific, consequential, ultimately catastrophic unwillingness to take a man at his published word, is perhaps the single most important thing the Nazi rise teaches about how democracies fail. Not the dramatic failure of a coup or an invasion or an obvious external attack, but the slow, rationalized, self-deceived failure of the people inside the system to recognize what was happening until it was too late to stop. That recognition, the recognition of what is actually happening, when what is actually happening is something you do not want to believe, is the most difficult political act available to human beings. It is difficult because acknowledging it requires action, and action has costs, and the costs are real. It is easier to tell yourself that the situation is probably not as bad as it seems. It is easier to assume that someone else will take responsibility. It is easier to calculate that the specific action required is probably not worth the specific cost of taking it. In Germany, in the late 1920s and early 1930s, enough people made those easier choices to allow the Nazi movement to consolidate power before the harder choices became possible. That is not a judgment on the individual character of those people. Most of them were, by ordinary measures, decent enough. It is a description of how this kind of failure happens, and why it tends to happen through the aggregation of individually defensible decisions rather than through any single spectacular betrayal. The individual decisions accumulate. The path clears. And one morning in January, an old man swears in a corporal, and the 20th century's worst catastrophe begins. The man who would become vice-chancellor of the Third Reich was, in the autumn of 1932, absolutely certain he had things under control. Franz von Papen, aristocratic, charming, intelligent in the conventional ways that intelligence shows itself in well-bred men who have never really been tested, was explaining to anyone who would listen why appointing Adolf Hitler as chancellor was not the catastrophe it might appear, but rather an extraordinarily clever piece of political management. The Nazis had the votes. Papen had the experience. Hitler would be given the title. The establishment would retain the power. In 2 months, Papen told colleagues who expressed concern, "We will have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he'll be squealing." It is one of the most consequentially wrong sentences in the history of modern politics. Papen was not alone in believing it. He was articulating the consensus of the German conservative establishment, men who looked at Hitler and saw a useful tool rather than a mortal danger. They were wrong in a way that cost the world 50 million lives. To understand how they got it so wrong, you have to understand the political situation Germany found itself in between September 1930 and January 1933. It is not a simple story. It is, in fact, one of the most complicated and vertiginous political narratives of the 20th century, full of men who were individually intelligent, making collectively catastrophic decisions, each one individually defensible, all of them together amounting to the destruction of the republic they claimed to be saving. Start with the arithmetic. After the September 1930 elections, the Reichstag looked like this. The Social Democrats had 143 seats. The Nazis had 107. The Catholic Center had 68. The Communists had 77. And the remaining seats were scattered among smaller parties. What this arithmetic meant, in practice, was that no government could command a majority without either including the Nazis or including the Communists. And both of those parties had made it explicit that they had no interest in participating in a government committed to preserving the Weimar Republic. Both wanted it dead. The Nazis wanted to replace it with a nationalist dictatorship. The Communists wanted to replace it with a Soviet-style state. Together, they held enough seats to block any centrist coalition from governing effectively. This was the trap, and the man appointed to navigate it was Heinrich Brüning, a center-party politician whom President Hindenburg chose as chancellor in March 1930 precisely because he was reliably conservative, respectful of presidential authority, and unlikely to pursue the kind of left-wing policies that Hindenburg, an 82-year-old Prussian aristocrat who had never quite accepted that Germany was now a republic, found distasteful. Brüning was also, unfortunately, committed to an economic policy of austerity, cutting government spending, raising taxes, reducing wages and prices, that, in the middle of the worst economic depression since the Industrial Revolution, served to deepen the crisis rather than alleviate it. He knew that his budget would not pass through the Reichstag. He passed it anyway, through emergency decree. Hindenburg signed the order. When the Reichstag voted to repeal the decree, as it had the constitutional right to do, Brüning dissolved the parliament and called new elections. This was not obviously unconstitutional. It was within the letter of the Weimar Constitution, but it established a precedent that the parliamentary system could be bypassed when governing through it became inconvenient, and that precedent would prove to be one of the most dangerous gifts that the Brüning era handed to its successors. The September 1930 elections that resulted were, as we have seen, the Nazi breakthrough. 107 seats, 18%. The political landscape had been transformed, and Brüning, governing by emergency decree with Hindenburg's backing, continued his austerity program regardless. The depression deepened. Unemployment rose. The Nazi vote in state elections kept growing. By the spring of 1932, when presidential elections were held, the situation had clarified almost unbearably. Hindenburg, the incumbent, was running for re-election at the age of 84. Not from desire but from a sense of duty, and at the explicit urging of the Social Democrats and other Republican parties who calculated that he was the only figure with enough prestige and authority to defeat Hitler in a direct election. The calculation proved correct, but barely. Hindenburg won the second round with 53%. Hitler received 36.8%, more than 13 million votes in a direct presidential race. The fringe agitator of 1923 had just received 13 million votes. In the Reichstag elections of July 1932, called after Hindenburg dismissed Brüning in May and appointed Papen as chancellor, the Nazis won 37.4% of the vote. 230 seats, the largest single party in Germany. Hitler was now the leader of the most popular political movement the country had. The constitutional logic was clear. The chancellor should be drawn from the largest party. But Hindenburg refused to appoint Hitler. The old field marshal despised Hitler personally. He called him the Bohemian Corporal, a sneering reference to Hitler's Austrian origins and his failure to rise above the rank of Lance Corporal, and genuinely feared what he might do with the office. When Hitler came to demand the chancellorship after the July elections, Hindenburg told him that he could not in good conscience give him full executive power. He offered Hitler the vice-chancellorship. Hitler refused. This refusal was a gamble, and for a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed as though the gamble might fail. The November 1932 elections brought the first real sign that the Nazi surge was receding. The party won 33.1%, down from 37.4% in July. They lost 34 seats. 2 million fewer votes. The economy was showing the very first faint signals of possible recovery. Voter fatigue with the constant campaign was real. Within the Nazi Party, there were genuine signs of internal crisis. Gregor Strasser, the party's organizational genius and its second most important figure, was negotiating secretly with Kurt von Schleicher, the new chancellor, who had replaced Papen in December 1932, about a cross-party arrangement that would include Nazi participation in government while leaving Hitler marginalized. If Strasser had succeeded, the history of the 20th century might have been different. He did not succeed. Hitler discovered the negotiations, called a meeting of the party leadership, and confronted Strasser with a fury that left no room for ambiguity. Strasser could not operate against Hitler's direct opposition within the party structure they had built together. The Führerprinzip that Hitler had insisted on, the absolute authority that flowed downward from the top, made any internal resistance impossible without splitting the movement, and Strasser was not willing to split it. He resigned all his positions in December 1932 and left politics. He was murdered in June 1934, during the Night of the Long Knives, as part of Hitler's settling of accounts with anyone who had ever questioned his authority. Schleicher's own chancellorship was collapsing. He had no Reichstag majority, no genuine political base, and had managed to alienate virtually everyone of any political consequence. The industrialists who had been funding the nationalists, Reich disliked him. Hindenburg was losing confidence in him. And Franz von Papen, whom Schleicher had displaced as chancellor and who had never forgiven the displacement, was working furiously behind the scenes to bring Schleicher down and restore himself to power. Papen's plan was elegantly simple in its conception and catastrophically naive in its assumptions. He would bring Hitler into government, give him the chancellorship he demanded, but surround him with reliable conservatives who would prevent him from acting on his more extreme intentions. The cabinet would have 11 ministers. Only 3 would be Nazis: Hitler as chancellor, Wilhelm Frick as interior minister, and Hermann Göring without portfolio. The other 8 positions would be held by Papen himself as vice-chancellor, by conservative generals, by nationalist politicians of the old school, men who understood governance and who would, Papen calculated, form an effective check on whatever Hitler might attempt. The flaw in this reasoning was not subtle. It required believing that Adolf Hitler would behave like a conventional coalition partner, that he would accept the constraints of collective cabinet decision-making, defer to the experience of his senior ministers, moderate his agenda in deference to political reality, and generally play by the rules of parliamentary governance that he had been explicitly and publicly declaring his contempt for since 1920. It required believing that a man who had written, in a published book, that parliamentary democracy was a Jewish-engineered system of weakness designed to prevent strong leadership, would become a cooperative participant in parliamentary democracy once he was given a share of power within it. It required believing that the movement he led, which had been terrorizing political opponents in the streets with paramilitaries for 12 years, would content itself with the procedures of constitutional governance once it had access to the levers of government. Papen believed all of this. He believed it because he looked at Hitler and saw someone he could understand, an ambitious man who had used extreme rhetoric to build a political base, and who would now moderate that rhetoric in the face of governing responsibilities, as ambitious politicians generally do. He did not understand, or could not bring himself to understand, that Hitler was not a politician who had used extremism as a tool. He was an extremist who had used politics as a tool. The extremism was the substance. The politics were the method. Once you gave him the power he had spent 15 years working toward, you were not going to moderate him. You were going to find out what the extremism actually meant. Papen took his plan to Hindenburg. He met with the president repeatedly through the first 3 weeks of January 1933. He brought endorsements, a letter from industrialists and bankers expressing support for Hitler's appointment, signatures from figures of economic weight who had calculated, as Papen had, that Hitler in government would be more useful and less dangerous than Hitler in opposition, organizing the street violence of the SA into a genuine threat to public order. He brought Hindenburg's own son Oscar into the conversation. Oscar met privately with Hitler, the content of that meeting never publicly disclosed, but Oscar emerged apparently convinced that the appointment should go forward. On January 4, 1933, Papen had met privately with Hitler at the home of the Cologne banker Kurt von Schroeder. The meeting lasted approximately an hour. Its substance was the terms of the deal: Hitler as chancellor, Papen as vice-chancellor, a cabinet composed mostly of conservatives. Hitler would have a title. The establishment would have the power. Papen would be back in government. Everyone would get something. The deal was done. Hindenburg was persuaded. On January 28th, Schleicher, facing a Reichstag scheduled to reconvene in days with a vote of no confidence practically guaranteed, asked Hindenburg for emergency powers to dissolve parliament and rule by decree. Hindenburg refused, and Schleicher resigned. Hindenburg gave Papen the task of forming a new government. On the morning of January 29th, Papen met with Hitler and Göring to finalize the cabinet. And on January 30th, 1933, at 11:30 in the morning, Paul von Hindenburg swore in Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of the German Reich. The ceremony in the president's office was brief and apparently joyless. Hindenburg, who had vowed never to appoint Hitler, who had called him the Bohemian corporal, who had met him with barely concealed contempt in their previous encounters, swore him in with a minimum of ceremony and could not bring himself to look directly at the man. He was 85 years old, exhausted, surrounded by advisors who had convinced him that this was the only remaining option. The ceremony took less than 5 minutes. That evening, the SA and SS marched through the Brandenburg Gate with torches. Tens of thousands of brown-shirt and black uniformed men, their boots striking the Berlin cobblestones in synchronized rhythm, their torches flooding the Wilhelmstrasse with orange light. Hindenburg watched from his window, visibly moved by the spectacle of this march in front of his palace. Hitler watched from the window of the chancellery across the square. He was weeping. From joy, from relief, from the specific vindication of a man who had been telling himself for 15 years that this moment was inevitable. Across Germany that night, Social Democrats and trade unionists and Jews and communists and ordinary liberals looked at the news and felt their stomachs drop. Many of them had been through the hyperinflation, through the putsch, through a decade of Nazi violence in the streets, and they were frightened. But many of them also told themselves what frightened people tell themselves, that surely it could not be as bad as it seemed. Surely the courts would constrain him. Surely the army would maintain its independence. Surely the established institutions would hold. They would not hold. They would not hold because Adolf Hitler had no intention of operating within them, and because he moved with a speed and a decisiveness that left no time for the institutional responses that might have stopped him. His first move was to call for new elections. The Nazis still did not have a parliamentary majority, and Hitler wanted one. Hindenburg dissolved the Reichstag and called elections for March 5, 1933. This was legally unimpeachable, and it gave the Nazi government approximately 5 weeks to conduct an election campaign while in control of the state apparatus for the first time. Göring, who had been given control of the Prussian Interior Ministry, and thus of the largest police force in Germany, reorganized the police immediately. Officers considered politically unreliable were dismissed. SA men were enrolled as auxiliary police, giving the party's paramilitary arm the legal authority to perform law enforcement functions, a breathtaking inversion of their previous status as the source of political violence. Göring issued explicit instructions that police should treat political violence from the left more seriously than political violence from the right, and that officers who were too cautious in confronting communist threats would be held accountable. The propaganda operation was working at maximum intensity. Goebbels, appointed Reich propaganda minister on March 13th, but already running the party's communications apparatus before the formal appointment, was producing material at an extraordinary rate. Radio broadcasts, newspaper articles, posters, film newsreels, all carrying the same message in endlessly varied forms. Germany reborn. Germany rising. The enemies of Germany, communists, Jews, international finance, on the run. Hitler as the strong, certain father figure who would restore what had been lost. The aesthetic of it was overwhelming. The forests of flags, the seas of uniformed men, the choreographed spectacle of thousands moving in perfect unity. Then, on the evening of February 27th, 1933, the Reichstag building burned. A 24-year-old Dutch construction worker named Marinus van der Lubbe set fire to it. Van der Lubbe was a communist, or had been, briefly, who believed, apparently with genuine conviction, that burning the German parliament would spark a communist uprising against fascism. He entered the building through a window and started fires across multiple sections of the interior. He was caught at the scene. He claimed sole responsibility, repeatedly and consistently, until his execution. The question of whether he acted alone, or whether the fire was arranged or at least facilitated by the Nazis as a pretext, has been debated by historians ever since, with most contemporary scholarship concluding that van der Lubbe probably did act alone, though the regime's exploitation of the fire was so immediate and so perfectly calibrated that the alternative hypothesis has never entirely disappeared. It did not much matter. What mattered was what Hitler and Göring did with it. Hitler arrived at the burning Reichstag within hours, surveyed the flames, and announced that this was the start of the communist revolt. The communists were rising. Germany was in danger. Emergency measures were required immediately. The next morning, February 28, 1933, Hindenburg signed the decree of the Reich president for the protection of the people and the state, known to history as the Reichstag Fire Decree. The document was brief, legally grounded in Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, and absolutely catastrophic in its implications. It suspended, without time limit, the following constitutional protections: personal liberty, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly and association, the secrecy of postal and telephone communications, and all protection against house searches and property confiscation. The decree also gave the central government authority to override the governments of individual German states and assume direct control. Every one of these protections was gone as of February 28, 1933. None of them would be restored while the Nazi regime lasted. The state of emergency declared that morning remained in effect until Germany's defeat in May 1945. The Weimar Republic's Bill of Rights was erased in a single document, signed by the same president who had sworn to protect the Constitution, on the basis of a fire whose origins remain historically disputed. The arrests began immediately. Communist Party leaders, Communist Reichstag deputies, trade union officials, social democratic organizers, journalists, lawyers, anyone who had been on a list, and the list had been in preparation for months. Within days, thousands were in custody, held in improvised detention facilities, SA premises, barracks, requisitioned warehouses. The first formal concentration camp, Dachau, opened on March 22, 1933, under SS authority, initially intended for political opponents of the new regime. Heinrich Himmler, who commanded the SS, announced its opening to the press in a matter-of-fact statement that described it as a facility for the organized detention of communists, Reichsbannermen, and social democrats who endangered state security. The March 5 elections were held in this atmosphere. Voter intimidation was pervasive. The Communist Party, which had won nearly 17% of the vote in November 1932, was effectively suppressed, its leaders imprisoned, its meetings banned, its press shut down. SA men stood outside polling stations in their brown uniforms, their presence an entirely unambiguous statement about the consequences of making the wrong choice. Even under these conditions, the Nazis won only 43.9%, not a majority. They still required their German National People's Party coalition partners to command the Reichstag. The Communist Party won 12%, a remarkable result given the repression, a testament to the depth of working-class opposition to Nazism that the regime would spend years attempting to eradicate. But the communist results would soon not matter, because the communist deputies would be prevented from taking their seats. Hitler needed one more piece of legal architecture to complete the transformation he had been planning since Mein Kampf. The Enabling Act, formally titled the law to remedy the distress of the people and the Reich, a title whose bureaucratic neutrality concealed the fact that it was a law to end democracy. The Enabling Act would give Hitler's cabinet the power to enact laws without the Reichstag's approval, including laws that contradicted the Constitution, for a period of 4 years, after which the law could simply be renewed. The Chancellor would be able to govern without Parliament, without oversight, without any constitutional check on his authority whatsoever. Passing it required a 2/3 supermajority of a constitutional quorum of the Reichstag. The Communists had been effectively expelled. Several Social Democratic deputies had been arrested or had fled. The Catholic Center, the swing vote, had been negotiated with intensively. Its leadership offered vague assurances about the protection of Catholic institutions and church rights that Hitler had no intention of honoring. On March 23, 1933, the Reichstag met in the Kroll Opera House. The Parliament building itself was still under repair from the fire, to vote on the act. SA men lined the corridors and the lobby. Every deputy who walked to their seat passed through ranks of brown uniformed men whose presence required no accompanying statement. The message was physical and immediate. This is the world now. This is what happens to people who make the wrong choice in this room. The deputies took their seats, and the session began. Hitler rose and gave a speech of extraordinary, cynical moderation. Calm, reasonable, full of assurances about the protection of the courts, the independence of the president, the preservation of the state's rights, the respect for religious institutions. He was giving a performance of a cooperative coalition partner for an audience that desperately wanted to believe in it. Every promise he made in that speech was a lie. Every assurance would be violated within months. But in the moment, in that charged, terrifying atmosphere, with the SA lining the corridors, the speech provided enough cover for men who had already decided to capitulate, but needed a story to tell themselves and their constituents about why they had done so. Then came the moment that history has preserved as one of its most important acts of individual moral clarity. Otto Wels stood up. He was the chairman of the Social Democratic Party, 59 years old, a man who had spent his career as a party organizer and parliamentarian rather than an orator, who was not known for particularly stirring rhetoric. He was not a celebrity. He was not a charismatic figure. He was a working politician who had devoted his life to the democratic socialist cause and who understood, with complete clarity, what was about to happen in that room. When the party had decided that they would oppose the Enabling Act, a decision that required real courage, because opposing it meant certain persecution, because several of their colleagues were already in custody, they needed someone to speak against it. Wels had volunteered. He had said simply, "I will do it." He spoke without notes. He spoke of what the Social Democrats had built, the Republic, the constitutional protections, the workers' rights, the social welfare provisions that had been fought for across generations. He acknowledged the reality of the moment, that the government had the votes, that the act might pass regardless of what the Social Democrats did. He refused to vote for it anyway. And, at the end, he said the words that have survived the century since he spoke them. In this historic hour, we German Social Democrats solemnly pledge ourselves to the principles of humanity and justice, of freedom and socialism. No enabling act gives you the power to destroy ideas that are eternal and indestructible. Hitler responded with fury, abandoning the moderate tone he had maintained through his own speech. He told the Social Democrats they were irrelevant. He told them Germany did not need their approval. He told them, in effect, to get out of the way of history. The vote was taken. 444 in favor, 94 against. Every party present, except the Social Democrats, voted in favor. The Communist deputies were absent, arrested, or in exile. The Catholic Center voted yes, having received no written guarantee of the assurances they had been promised, and having decided to proceed anyway. The various conservative and nationalist parties voted yes. Even some of the deputies who had expressed private reservations about the act voted yes, calculating that opposing it was more dangerous than supporting it. Only the Social Democrats held. 94 people in that opera house, surrounded by armed men, watched by a chancellor who had already demonstrated his willingness to use emergency decrees against political opponents, and they voted no. They all knew what it would cost them. Most of them were in exile within weeks. The The Social Democratic Party was formally banned on June 22, 1933. Otto Wels himself left Germany and established the party's exile organization in Prague. He died in Paris in September 1939, 2 weeks after the war began. The Enabling Act passed, and Adolf Hitler became the legal, constitutional, formally empowered dictator of Germany. The Weimar Republic, battered and hollowed and finally collapsed, was gone. It had lasted 14 years. It had been built in impossible circumstances by imperfect people who believed, genuinely, that Germany could govern itself democratically. They were defeated not simply by the economic catastrophe of the Depression, not simply by the savagery of the Nazi movement, but by the failures of nerve and judgment of men who thought they were managing the situation, who thought they were clever enough to use the Nazi movement as a tool without being consumed by it. They were not. Nobody was clever enough for that. What followed the Enabling Act was a process the Nazis called Gleichschaltung, coordination, synchronization, the imposition of Nazi control over every independent institution in German public life. It was rapid, systematic, and comprehensive. The trade unions were abolished in a single morning, May 2nd, 1933. SA and SS units raided union offices simultaneously across Germany, arrested leaders, seized funds, and disbanded organizations that had represented German workers for decades. The German Labor Front replaced them, a Nazi body with no independent authority and no right of collective bargaining. The ritual murder of organized labor was completed in hours. The political parties dissolved themselves in June and July, reading the trajectory of events with sufficient clarity to understand that voluntary dissolution was safer than waiting to be banned. The Social Democrats, who had not dissolved themselves voluntarily, were formally banned by decree on June 22nd. On July 14th, Germany was declared by law a one-party state. The NSDAP was the only legal political party in Germany. This was announced not apologetically, but triumphantly, as the fulfillment of historical destiny. The press came under control through the Reich press chamber. Membership was required to work as a journalist, and membership was denied to Jews and political opponents. Radio fell to Goebbels' Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, established March 13th. Universities were purged of Jewish professors and those considered politically unreliable through the law for the restoration of the professional civil service of April 7, 1933. On May 10, 1933, students and SA men burned thousands of books in public bonfires across Germany. The works of Jewish authors, Marxists, liberals, pacifists, anyone whose ideas contradicted Nazi ideology. Goebbels spoke at the Berlin bonfire, at the heart of the old imperial capital, while the flames consumed the intellectual heritage of a civilization. In each of these actions, the machinery of the state was turned against the very citizens it was supposed to serve. And in each of them, the acquiescence of the German population, not enthusiastic support, in most cases, but the absence of resistance, cleared the path. People who were not yet directly affected told themselves that the situation was probably temporary, that things would settle down, that the worst interpretations were probably excessive. People who were directly affected had already discovered that the state apparatus that might have protected them had been captured. By the summer of 1933, Adolf Hitler had achieved something that the Beer Hall Putsch of November 1923 had failed to deliver: effective, legal, constitutional control of the German state. He had done it not through violence, though violence had been essential in creating the political climate, but through the ballot box, through backroom deals, through the exploitation of constitutional mechanisms that the Republic's founders had built in good faith as safety valves for genuine emergencies. He had done it through the cooperation, however reluctant, of men who thought they were smarter than him. There remained one more institution that needed to be captured before the transformation was complete: the military. The German army, the Reichswehr, had maintained a certain institutional independence through the first months of the Nazi government. Its commanders were professional soldiers of the old school, many of them aristocrats, suspicious of the Nazi movement's vulgarity and hostile to Rome's SA, which had begun making noises about absorbing the regular army into a new people's military. Hindenburg was still alive, still technically president, still technically commander-in-chief. Hindenburg died on August 2nd, 1934. He was 86 years old. He had served Germany through 2 world wars, through the chaos of the early republic, and through the final act of handing power to the man who would destroy everything he had spent his life serving. Whether he understood, at the end, what he had done remains a matter of speculation. Within hours of his death, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer und Reichskanzler, leader and Chancellor of Germany. And every officer and every soldier of the German military was required to swear an oath. Not to the Constitution, not to Germany, not to the office of Commander-in-Chief, to Adolf Hitler, by name, personally, individually, as a matter of personal loyalty. Every officer swore the oath. Every soldier swore it. The last institutional barrier to absolute personal dictatorship was gone. 2 months before that, on June 30th, the night of the long knives, Hitler had demonstrated what his authority meant in practice. Ernst Röhm, the SA commander who had built the paramilitary force to more than 2 million members, and who was demanding a second revolution that would break the power of big business and the aristocracy, was arrested and shot. Along with him died dozens of SA leaders, several conservative politicians, including former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher, and a number of others who had accumulated personal enemies within the regime. The killings were ordered by Hitler personally, carried out by the SS and the Gestapo, and retroactively legalized by a cabinet decree declaring them acts of state self-defense. The courts found no objection. The public received the official version, that a Rome coup had been preempted, and by and large accepted it. The lesson was explicit and intentional. This was what it meant to be on the wrong side of Adolf Hitler. This was what the rule of law meant in the Third Reich. And from that June night forward, anyone within the German power structure who might have considered resistance understood, with complete clarity, what resistance meant. Germany was a dictatorship. The transformation had taken 18 months from the day Hitler was sworn in. It had been accomplished legally, constitutionally, through mechanisms that the Weimar Republic had built in good faith, and that the Nazi movement had exploited with extraordinary skill. It had been enabled by the miscalculations of intelligent men, the passivity of ordinary people, the failure of institutions that should have held firm, and the specific genius of a movement that understood better than its opponents the difference between the letter of democracy and its spirit. The spirit of democracy, the genuine commitment to human dignity, to the rule of law, to the accountability of power, to the protection of minorities against majorities, had been insufficient to hold the institutions together under the specific combination of pressures the Weimar Republic had faced. And what came after it, in Germany and in the world, was the direct, traceable consequence of that insufficiency. Part 3 of this documentary asks the question that all of this demands we ask. Not just what happened, but why. Not just the specific sequence of events in Germany between 1919 and 1934, but the deeper patterns, the human capacities and social conditions and institutional vulnerabilities that made all of it possible. And the question that all of that points toward, the question we cannot avoid if we are honest, could happen again. Before we arrive at part 3 in that reckoning, there are elements of the story between 1930 and 1933 that deserve fuller attention, because they illuminate something important about the relationship between economic crisis, political psychology, and the specific texture of democratic failure. Consider the experience of the German cities in 1931 and 1932. Not Berlin or Munich specifically, but the smaller cities, the provincial towns, the places where the Depression hit in ways that were intensely personal and inescapably visible. In a city like Wuppertal or Dessau, or any of dozens of industrial centers across Germany, you could see the depression in the faces of people on the street. The men who stood at labor exchange offices from before opening time, waiting in queues that stretched around the block. The shop fronts with their paper signs in the windows, Ausverkauf, going out of business. The children who came to school without breakfast. The families who had moved into single rooms because they could no longer afford their apartments, crowding in with relatives who were themselves barely managing. The women who made increasingly desperate calculations about food, which meals could be skipped, which ingredients could be stretched further, how to feed children who were growing and hungry on a budget that was shrinking every month. Into those cities came the Nazis, not just with speeches, though the speeches were continuous. Hitler crisscrossed Germany by airplane in 1932, landing in city after city, in a campaign style that felt modern and dynamic in ways that the Social Democrats' patient organizational work never could. But also with the SA, the brown shirts who were in those cities every day, handing out leaflets, running soup kitchens, organizing charity drives, very deliberately presenting themselves as the party that was actually present in the crisis, actually doing something, actually showing up. The optics were carefully managed. The Nazis understood that in a time of emergency, the perception of action mattered as much as actual policy. They could not fix the Depression. No party could fix the Depression quickly, not in 1931 and 1932. But they could be seen to be fighting. They could name enemies. They could promise that when they had power, the people responsible would answer. The Communist Party offered something similar. The identification of class enemies, the promise of revolution that would upend the existing order and create a new one in which the workers had power. And the communists drew significant support from the unemployed, particularly in Berlin and in the industrial North. But the communists had two disadvantages that the Nazis did not share. First, the Soviet model was a genuine deterrent for many middle-class Germans who feared not just economic change, but the complete social revolution that communism implied. Second, the Communist Party's leadership in Germany was, during this period, following instructions from Moscow that required them to treat the Social Democrats as social fascists, as the primary enemy, rather than cooperating with them against the Nazi threat. This catastrophic strategic error, driven by Soviet ideological requirements rather than German political reality, meant that the two largest parties of the left were fighting each other as much as they were fighting the Nazis, and the mutual exhaustion and mutual suspicion of the left wing contributed directly to the Nazi victory. The political center, meanwhile, was being squeezed from both sides. The Social Democrats were losing voters to the communists on their left and to the Nazis on their right, among workers who had given up on the party's cautious reformism. The Catholic Center was holding its core constituency, but struggling to present a compelling vision of how to manage the crisis. The liberal parties, the German Democratic Party and the German People's Party, were collapsing, their middle-class constituencies fleeing first to smaller nationalist parties and then, in increasing numbers, to the Nazis themselves. Why did middle-class Germans vote Nazi? This question has attracted decades of historical analysis, and the answers are more complex than the simple narrative of desperate people turning to desperate solutions. Research on voting patterns in Weimar Germany suggests that the Nazi vote was remarkably broad. It came from farmers facing foreclosure, from Protestant small-town residents who had never voted for any left-wing party and who saw the Republic as a godless, cosmopolitan thing, from young men who had grown up during the war and its aftermath, and who had absorbed the stab-in-the-back mythology as historical fact, from civil servants and pensioners whose fixed incomes had been destroyed first by inflation and were now being further reduced by deflationary austerity, from women who responded to the Nazi image of strong male leadership after years of political and economic chaos. What united these disparate constituencies was less a coherent ideological commitment to Nazism than a shared sense that the existing political order had failed them, that the mainstream parties were incapable of addressing the crisis with the necessary urgency, and that something dramatically different was required. The Nazis provided the something dramatically different. Whether the specific content of that difference, the anti-Semitism, the racial ideology, the commitment to dictatorship, was what most of these voters were primarily voting for, is a genuinely contested historical question. Many historians argue that the racial ideology was secondary for most Nazi voters, who were primarily responding to the economic program and the promise of strong leadership. Others argue that the anti-Semitism was more central than this analysis allows. What is not contested is the result. Whether they voted for the anti-Semitism specifically, or for the economic program, or for the performance of strength and certainty, they voted for a movement whose stated and published intentions included the destruction of democratic governance, the elimination of Jews from German civic life, the conquest of territory in the East through war, and the establishment of a racial dictatorship. They voted for it, and they got it. The conservative establishment, the Poppins and the Hugenbergs, the industrialists and the generals and the Junker landowners, made their own calculation, a calculation that was, in a different way, equally catastrophic. They needed Hitler's votes. They did not like Hitler's methods. They believed they could manage him. The logic was not entirely unreasonable on its surface. If you're going to have a radical nationalist government, it is better to be inside it than outside it. Better to participate and moderate than to oppose and be swept aside. Better to use Hitler's popular support as a governing tool, while keeping the levers of real power in more experienced and responsible hands. The logic failed for a reason that should have been visible in advance and was not, because the people making the calculation were constitutionally incapable of taking seriously the genuine radicalism of the movement they were proposing to use as a tool. They looked at Hitler and saw a demagogue who could be tamed. They should have looked at Mein Kampf and seen a program that was going to be executed, because its author had been telling them for 8 years that he intended to execute it. Franz von Papen lived. He was placed under house arrest briefly during the Night of the Long Knives, close enough to death that he could not have missed the message, and spent the rest of the Nazi era in diplomatic limbo, his influence entirely gone, the conservative establishment he had represented entirely captured. He was acquitted at Nuremberg on the grounds that the Allied tribunal could not prove criminal conspiracy beyond reasonable doubt. He died in 1969 at the age of 89. He wrote his memoirs and never adequately explained how he had been quite so wrong about quite such important things. Alfred Hugenberg, the press baron who had aligned his German National People's Party with the Nazis in the Harzburg Front, and who entered Hitler's cabinet as economics minister in January 1933, was forced out of the cabinet within 6 months of the government's formation. His newspapers were either Nazified or shut down. The movement he thought he was using had used him and discarded him. Hindenburg died on August 2nd, 1934, knowing, or perhaps not knowing, depending on the degree to which the old man's mind was clear at the end, what he had done. He had been the last genuine institutional check on Hitler's power, and he had failed to use that check effectively. The oath the military swore to Hitler personally, within hours of Hindenburg's death, completed the transformation. Germany was now, fully and irreversibly, a personal dictatorship. The speed of the transformation, from Hitler's appointment on January 30th, 1933, to the military oath on August 2nd, 1934, a span of 18 months, remains one of the most astonishing aspects of the Nazi seizure of power. Not astonishing because it was uniquely fast, but astonishing because it happened at that speed to a country that had real, functioning democratic institutions, a genuinely free press, organized and experienced political parties, and a military with its own institutional traditions. All of these things gave way within 18 months. Not because they were overwhelmed by irresistible force, but because the specific combination of pressures applied to them, the depression, the constitutional exploitation, the political miscalculations, the street violence, the propaganda, the personal authority of Hitler himself, proved sufficient to dismantle them before they could organize an effective response. Part 3 now turns to the question of why that happened, what it reveals about the vulnerabilities of democratic systems generally, and what it demands of us in the present. Let us stay for a moment with the propaganda machine, because no account of how the Nazis took and held power is complete without understanding how Joseph Goebbels transformed political communication in ways that made everything else possible. Goebbels was 28 years old when he joined the Nazi Party in 1924. He had a doctorate in Romantic literature from the University of Heidelberg. He was physically small, limping from a childhood case of osteomyelitis that had left his right leg shorter than his left, and he was brilliant in the specific way that makes a man dangerous. He understood people. He understood how emotion worked in politics. He understood that most people form political opinions not through rational analysis of policy positions, but through identification, through feeling, through the sense that a particular leader or movement understands them and speaks for them. He had studied Hitler's speeches. He had watched what worked. And then he applied those principles to every medium available in 1920s and 1930s Germany, with a systematic thoroughness that had no precedent in the history of political communication. Hitler appointed him head of party propaganda in April 1930, and what Goebbels built over the next 3 years was something entirely new: a multi-platform, coordinated, emotionally calibrated political communications operation that reached into every corner of German life. The party newspaper, a network of regional newspapers that Goebbels coordinated for maximum message consistency. Film newsreels produced specifically to showcase Nazi events in the most favorable light. Radio, which Goebbels understood before almost anyone else in German politics, was the most powerful political medium yet developed, capable of delivering the voice of a leader directly into the living rooms of every household in Germany. Posters designed with a graphic sophistication that used color, composition, and iconography to convey the movement's energy and inevitability without requiring anyone to read a single word. The content of all of this propaganda was calibrated to specific audiences in ways that were, for their time, remarkably sophisticated. The farmers received different materials than the factory workers. The mothers received different imagery than the veterans. The young men who were the SA's recruiting base received different messaging than the middle-class voters who were being invited to see Nazism as a respectable alternative to the chaos of the Republic. But all of it shared the same emotional architecture. Germany is in danger. The enemies are identifiable. The solution is Hitler. The moment is now. The mass rallies that Goebbels orchestrated, the great Nazi Party events, the Nuremberg rallies, were propaganda in the most complete sense. Total environments designed to produce a specific emotional state in everyone who attended them. The imagery was overwhelming. Hundreds of thousands of uniformed men in precise formation. Forests of flags. The specific choreography of arrival, of anticipation, of the moment when Hitler appeared and the crowd erupted. The lighting designed to create a cathedral-like effect of power and solemnity. The music timed to build and release emotional tension. The architecture of the stadium. Albert Speer's design specifically intended to make the human beings inside them feel simultaneously small and part of something immeasurably larger than themselves. These were not political events in the conventional sense. They were theatrical rituals of collective identity. They told people who attended them and who saw footage of them in the newsreels, this is the future. This is unstoppable. You are on the right side of history. And people believed it. Not all of them. Not even most of them. If the elections of 1932, the last genuinely free elections, are taken as a guide. But enough of them. Enough to deliver the vote share that created the parliamentary mathematics that gave the conservative establishment the justification it needed to bring Hitler into government. And once he was in government, enough to provide the social passivity that allowed the transformation of the Republic into the dictatorship to proceed without the organized resistance that might have stopped it. What Goebbels built in those years was not simply effective political communications. It was a system for manufacturing consent at scale, for creating the perception of inevitability around a political movement that was, in fact, making choices at every stage, choices that could have been made differently. The sense that the Nazis were unstoppable, that history was moving in their direction, that resistance was futile. This was not a neutral description of political reality. It was the product of a sophisticated communications operation designed to produce exactly that sense. An understanding that it was manufactured, that it required effort, strategy, and enormous resources to sustain, is part of understanding how it might be resisted. Because propaganda that manufactures the appearance of inevitability depends, critically, on people accepting the appearances it manufactures. It depends on people not asking, is this actually true? Is the movement actually as strong as it claims? Is the leader actually as certain as he appears? Is the crisis actually as acute as the propaganda insists? When people stop accepting the appearances and start asking those questions, the spell breaks. It does not break easily. It does not break quickly. It requires courage and community. The courage to say what you see rather than what you are supposed to see, and the community of other people who are willing to do the same. But it is possible. The 94 Social Democrats who voted against the Enabling Act knew this. They knew they could not stop the vote. They voted no anyway, because the vote was not about stopping the act in that moment. It was about refusing to validate it, about insisting, in the face of all the manufactured inevitability, that this was not actually inevitable, that human beings were making choices, that those choices were wrong, that someone, somewhere was saying so. That refusal, small, costly, ultimately insufficient to prevent the catastrophe, is the thread this channel holds on to. Because without witnesses who refuse, without people who say what they see, the manufactured reality becomes the only available reality. And that is when the most dangerous things become possible. There is a dimension of the political story between 1930 and 1933 that deserves fuller attention because it illuminates the specific moment when the Republic's fate was sealed, the period between the November 1932 elections and the January 30th appointment, the 8 weeks when the decision was made that changed everything. After the November 1932 elections, in which the Nazi vote fell for the first time, there was a genuine, brief window in which the political trajectory might have changed. The party was losing momentum. Its treasury was nearly depleted from months of continuous campaigning. Goebbels wrote in his diary that if things did not improve soon, the party would fall apart. Gregor Strasser, the organizational genius who had built the party's national structure, was negotiating with Schleicher in ways that might have split the movement. Hitler himself was in a state of unusual desperation, telling associates in December 1932 that if the party was not in power by Christmas, he would end it all. Statements so dramatic that his aides took them seriously enough to maintain a watch on him. The party did not fall apart. Strasser was driven out. Schleicher could not form a functioning government, and Papen found his way back to influence. But the point is that in those 8 weeks, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The Nazi political crisis of late 1932 was real. The forces that resolved it in Hitler's favor, Papen's ambition, Hindenburg's exhaustion, the conservative establishment's fear of the left, and their lingering belief that they could manage the radical right, were human choices made by specific people at a specific moment. They were not the only choices available. The German industrialists who signed their letter of support for Hitler's appointment in January 1933, men like Hjalmar Schacht, who would later become Hitler's finance minister, were not acting from ideological conviction. They were acting from interest calculation, the belief that Hitler's government would be more favorable to business than any left-wing alternative, and the belief that the conservative ministers in his cabinet would moderate his economic radicalism. They were calculating wrongly, as it turned out, because the Nazi economic program, once implemented, was far more statist and far less friendly to traditional business interests than they had anticipated. But in January 1933, the calculation seemed reasonable enough to sign their names to a letter that helped tip Hindenburg's decision. Each of these individual actors, Papen, Hindenburg, Schacht, the industrialists, Oskar von Hindenburg, the military leadership, was making a decision that seemed, from their specific vantage point and with their specific information, defensible. The catastrophe was not the product of villainous intent across the board, though some of the actors were villainous enough. It was the product of the aggregation of individually defensible decisions made by people who were each, in their own way, trying to protect their own interests or their country as they understood it. This is what makes the story of Weimar's final weeks so instructive and so disturbing. It illustrates that democratic destruction does not require a conspiracy of evil men. It requires only enough people making enough self-interested, short-sighted, wrong decisions in a context of genuine crisis, guided by frameworks of analysis that are inadequate to the specific nature of the threat they are facing. The framework that failed Popin and the others was the framework of conventional political management. The assumption that all political actors, however extreme in their rhetoric, ultimately want what all political actors want, a share of power, handled through the familiar mechanisms of coalition and compromise. Hitler did not want that. He had always wanted something categorically different. And the people who thought they could manage him through the mechanisms of coalition and compromise discovered this too late. The window closed on January 30th, 1933. Not absolutely. Not in the sense that resistance became completely impossible from that day forward. The Social Democrats voted no on March 23rd. Trade unionists resisted on May 2nd. Individuals across Germany, for years after 1933, found ways to refuse, to preserve, to subvert. But the organized, institutional resistance that could have actually changed the outcome, that could have stopped the consolidation of the dictatorship, became progressively impossible as the Gleichschaltung proceeded. Each institution that fell made the next institution's defense harder. Each opposition figure arrested made the next act of opposition more costly. The process was self-reinforcing. The more complete the control, the more difficult the resistance. The more difficult the resistance, the more complete the control became. By August 2nd, 1934, it was over. The Weimar Republic was gone. The Third Reich was fully established. The war was 5 years away. The Holocaust was 7. But the chain of causation, from the hyperinflation of 1923 to the Depression of 1929, from the September 1930 elections to the enabling act of March 1933, from the Night of the Long Knives to the personal oath sworn to Adolf Hitler, was complete. The trajectory was set. Part 3 of this documentary steps back from that trajectory and asks the deepest question, not what happened, but what it means. Not the sequence of events, but the human patterns those events reveal. Not just the German case, but the general lessons about democratic fragility and the conditions under which those lessons might and must be applied. It is tempting, when studying the history of the Nazi rise, to treat it as a story about exceptional circumstances, about the specific, unrepeatable catastrophe of Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, about a combination of war defeat and economic devastation and political inexperience and cultural anti-Semitism, so unique that no serious comparison to anything in the present could be made. This temptation should be resisted, not because contemporary situations are necessarily equivalent to Weimar Germany. They often are not, and careless analogies can be as misleading as no analogies at all. But because the specific mechanisms that enable the Nazi rise are not historically unique. They are general, they are human, and they operate whenever the conditions that enable them in Germany are replicated elsewhere. This final section of the documentary examines those mechanisms, not with the intention of frightening, but with the intention of explaining, because explanation is the only form of protection that is actually available to us. We cannot armor democratic societies against all threats. We can understand the nature of the threats, identify the conditions that make societies vulnerable to them, and make clear-eyed choices about what to defend and how to defend it. Begin with the simplest and most powerful mechanism: economic desperation as a political accelerant. The correlation between economic misery and Nazi electoral support in Weimar Germany is not subtle. In May 1928, with unemployment around 4%, the Nazis won 2.6% of the vote. In September 1930, with unemployment above 15%, they won 18.3%. In July 1932, with unemployment approaching 30%, they won 37.4%. In November 1932, when unemployment had edged slightly lower and the first faint signals of economic recovery were visible, they fell back to 33.1%. The relationship was not mechanical. Many Germans who were unemployed voted communist. Many who were employed voted Nazi. But the broad pattern is unmistakable. Mass economic desperation created the electorate that the Nazi movement needed. This is not a uniquely German phenomenon. Research in political science consistently finds that economic crisis correlates with the rise of radical and extremist movements across countries and time periods. People who are suffering seek explanations for their suffering and leaders who promise to address it. When mainstream parties fail to address economic crisis adequately, or are perceived to have failed, the political space for alternatives expands dramatically, and radical movements are positioned to occupy that space if they have been building the infrastructure and the rhetoric to do so. The specific form that this dynamic took in Germany was shaped by factors that gave it a particular destructive power. The hyperinflation of 1923 had already destroyed the German middle class's savings and their trust in financial institutions once. When the Depression hit in 1929, it hit a population that had already been through one economic catastrophe and whose tolerance for institutional failure was close to zero. The accumulated grievance from Versailles, from the stab-in-the-back myth, from the specific humiliation of a nation that believed it had been cheated rather than defeated, provided an emotional framework within which the Depression could be interpreted not as an impersonal economic force, but as the deliberate work of enemies. And the Nazi movement had been building, since 1919, the vocabulary and the organizational infrastructure to exploit exactly this combination of circumstances. When the Depression arrived, they were ready. They had the speakers. They had the propaganda machinery. They had the paramilitary force that could simultaneously terrorize opponents and demonstrate to potential supporters that the movement was a force to be reckoned with. They had, above all, a leader whose particular genius for giving collective desperation a voice and a target had been sharpened across a decade of performance. The mainstream parties were not ready. The Social Democrats were committed to cautious, incremental reformism that had served them well in more stable times, but was fatally inadequate to the emotional velocity of the 1930 to 1933 crisis. The center was trapped between its commitment to democratic governance and its conservative base, which was increasingly attracted to the Nazis' promise of strength and order. The liberal parties had no mass base and no compelling message, and the Communist Party, by treating the Social Democrats as the primary enemy, ensured that the left went into the decisive crisis divided rather than united. The lesson is not that radical movements are inevitable when economic crises occur. They are not. Many democratic societies have survived severe economic crises without producing genocidal movements. The lesson is that economic crisis creates conditions of vulnerability, and that the specific outcome depends on whether the political mainstream is capable of addressing the crisis with sufficient urgency and credibility to prevent the radical alternatives from filling the space. When democratic governments can demonstrate that they are capable of managing crisis effectively, when mainstream leaders can speak to the emotional reality of desperate people with genuine credibility, radical movements find their oxygen supply cut off. When it is not, the space opens, and whoever is best positioned to occupy it will. Now consider the mechanism of institutional erosion, which in Germany began before the Nazis were in a position to demand it, and was handed to them as a ready-made instrument of dictatorship. Heinrich Brüning's decision to govern by emergency decree, beginning in 1930, was a decision made by a democratically elected chancellor in a functioning republic, using constitutional mechanisms in ways that the Constitution permitted but had not intended for routine use. He was not a Nazi. He was a center-party conservative who believed he was managing a crisis with pragmatic realism. He bypassed Parliament because Parliament could not agree on his austerity program. He got Hindenburg to sign the decrees because that was how Article 48 worked. He did all of this within the letter of the Weimar Constitution. But in doing so, he established a pattern. When the democratic process produces inconvenient results, use emergency powers to go around it. Article 48 was used 42 times in 1931 alone, more than in all the preceding years of the Republic combined. Germany was being governed, in practice, by presidential decree rather than by parliamentary majority, under Brüning and his successors Papen and Schleicher. The Republic had been hollowed out from within before Hitler ever entered the Chancellery, and the tools of its hollowing, the emergency powers, the presidential decrees, the bypassing of Parliament, were ready for him to use when he arrived. This is perhaps the most disturbing element of the Weimar story from the perspective of democratic theory, because it illustrates that democratic erosion does not require an autocrat. Democratic erosion can be the work of people who consider themselves Democrats, who believe they are saving the Republic by bypassing its procedures, who are convinced that the circumstances justify the exception. The road to democratic destruction is often paved with pragmatic intentions. Each individual step away from democratic norms can be individually justified. It is the accumulation of those steps, the normalization of the exception, the routinization of what was supposed to be emergency, that creates the institutional vulnerability that an autocrat can exploit. Related to this is the mechanism that political scientists call the taming fallacy, the belief held by conservative elites in multiple countries and periods that radical movements can be brought into government and moderated by the responsibilities of office. Papen believed this about Hitler. He was not alone. Similar calculations have been made, and similarly failed, in other times and places. The calculation fails for a consistent reason. It assumes that the radical movement is primarily motivated by the desire for power, and that once power is achieved, the radicalism will be managed by the normal constraints of governance. But when the radical movement is primarily motivated by ideology, by a genuine commitment to transforming the existing order, power is not the end point. It is the beginning point. It is the instrument through which the transformation is effected. Hitler wanted power not to enjoy it, but to use it. He had a program, spelled out in Mein Kampf, and he intended to execute that program. The conservative establishment that thought it could tame him failed to understand this because it was constitutionally unable to take him at his word. Gentlemen, in their experience, said extreme things in public and did moderate things in practice. Hitler said extreme things in public and did extreme things in practice at the maximum possible speed. Now consider the mechanism of ordinary human compliance, which is perhaps the most uncomfortable element of the Nazi story for people who would like to believe that they would have been among the resistors. In 1961, the social psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted a series of experiments at Yale University that are now among the most famous in the history of psychology. He recruited ordinary people, men and women from the New Haven area, a range of ages and backgrounds, and asked them to participate in what was described as a learning experiment. The participant played the role of teacher. Another person, an actor, played the student. The teacher was instructed to deliver electric shocks to the student when he answered incorrectly, increasing the voltage with each wrong answer. The shock generator was labeled with warnings from slight shock all the way to danger, severe shock, and XXX. The shocks were fake. The student was an actor. But the participants did not know this. And what Milgram found, what shocked him in the academic world and has been replicated in various forms in dozens of subsequent studies, was that approximately 65% of ordinary Americans administered what they believed to be the maximum, potentially lethal electric shock to another human being under the instruction of an authority figure in a white lab coat. Not because they were sadists, not because they did not find it distressing. Many of them showed visible distress, sweat, and trembling, and repeated expressions of concern about whether the student was all right. But they kept going, because the authority figure told them to, because the situation had a structure that made compliance feel like the normal and expected behavior, and resistance feel like the abnormal deviation that required special justification. Milgram was not studying Germany. He was studying New Haven, Connecticut, in 1961. But his findings illuminate something important about how ordinary compliance operates in systems that direct it toward destructive ends. The mechanisms of obedience, the deference to authority, the diffusion of responsibility across large organizational structures, the normalization of behavior through incremental escalation, are not specific to any culture or country. They are features of human psychology that operate wherever the conditions that activate them are present. Christopher Browning's 1992 study of Reserve Police Battalion 101 a German unit tasked with mass shootings of Jews in occupied Poland in 1942, composed of ordinary middle-aged men who had not been selected for particular ideological commitment or cruelty, found that the battalion's members killed approximately 38,000 Jews and deported approximately 45,000 more to the death camps. Their commanding officer, Major Wilhelm Trapp, wept when he announced the first killing mission and offered any man who felt unable to participate the option of being assigned to other duties. A handful of men took him up on it. The rest participated, and their participation was sustained not primarily by fanatical anti-Semitism, though that played a role, but by peer pressure, by the organizational structure that distributed moral responsibility across many individuals, by the specifically German context of military duty and unit cohesion, and by the gradual normalization of behavior that had been preceded by years of anti-Semitic propaganda, making the victims seem less than fully human. These findings, Milgram's and Browning's and many others in the decades since, do not excuse what happened. They explain it, and they explain it in a way that should be genuinely disturbing, because they suggest that the perpetrators were not exceptional. They were, by the standards of psychological research, ordinary. The conditions that produced their behavior were specific to their historical moment, but the human capacities those conditions activated, the deference to authority, the peer compliance, the ability to perform actions that would be unthinkable in a different context because the context frames them as normal, are universal. This is Hannah Arendt's insight about the banality of evil, derived from her observation of the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961. Adolf Eichmann, who had been one of the key administrators of the Holocaust deportation system, who had organized the logistics of moving millions of people from across Europe to the extermination camps, was, in Arendt's account, not a monster in any conventional sense. He was a bureaucrat, a man of limited imagination and genuine mediocrity who had found, in the Nazi bureaucracy, a context in which his talent for logistics and his desire for career advancement could be applied without moral reflection. He did not need to think of himself as a murderer because the system was organized so that no individual at any level needed to take personal moral responsibility for the whole. He organized transport. Others ran the camps. Others built the chambers. Others administered the gas. Each person did their part, and the parts together produced Auschwitz. This structure, the diffusion of responsibility across large bureaucratic systems, so that no individual need confront the full moral weight of what they are collectively doing, is not specific to Nazi Germany. It is a feature of large organizations generally. What made Nazi Germany different was that the whole system was oriented toward criminal ends, and that the mechanisms for stopping it, democratic accountability, independent courts, free press, autonomous civil society, had been systematically destroyed in the first 18 months of Hitler's rule. When those mechanisms are present and functioning, individuals within the system have recourse. They can appeal to courts. They can speak to journalists. They can organize politically. They can refuse, knowing that the system contains protections for people who refuse. When those mechanisms are destroyed, individuals within the system have no recourse. Refusal means persecution. Speaking means imprisonment. The system becomes self-sealing, and the ordinary human tendency toward compliance with authority, with peer pressure, with the institutional context in which one operates, produces outcomes that each individual participant might be incapable of choosing alone. This is why the destruction of democratic mechanisms matters so much, and why it matters before it is complete. Once the courts are captured, once the press is controlled, once civil society is suppressed, once the political opposition is imprisoned or exiled, it is too late to rely on those mechanisms to stop what is happening. The time to defend them is when they are still functioning, when defending them still carries some risk, but not the absolute risk that resistance carries in a mature totalitarian system. The people who understood this in Germany in 1933 were the Social Democrats who voted against the Enabling Act, and the trade union officials who resisted the dissolution of the unions, and the journalists who kept reporting on Nazi violence even after most of the press had been cowed into silence. They were not superhuman. They did not have access to information or moral capacities unavailable to their contemporaries. They had made a prior decision that democratic values were worth defending even at personal cost, and that prior decision governed their behavior when the cost was actually being extracted. The making of that prior decision, the decision that there are things worth defending even at cost, is the most important political act available to ordinary people in ordinary times. It is the decision that makes the difference when times stop being ordinary between those who hold and those who fold. What does this mean in practice? It means several concrete things. First, it means taking seriously what political movements say they intend to do. The German conservatives who brought Hitler to power in January 1933 did not take seriously what Mein Kampf said. They could not bring themselves to believe that a person who sought political power would actually do the things he had published that he intended to do. When a political movement tells you its intentions, when it publishes them in books, speaks them at rallies, demonstrates them in its treatment of opponents, believing it is the minimum requirement for political seriousness, discounting the stated intentions of a radical movement because they seem too extreme is not sophistication. It is the specific failure of imagination that enabled the Nazi catastrophe. Second, it means protecting democratic institutions before they are under threat, not after. The time to insist on the independence of the judiciary is when the judiciary is still independent. The time to insist on the freedom of the press is when the press is still free. The time to insist on the accountability of elected officials is when those officials are still accountable. Institutions do not defend themselves. They are defended by people, by citizens, by civil society organizations, by politicians willing to incur costs, by journalists willing to report what is happening even when powerful people want them not to. The defense needs to be built when the building is still possible, because the specific sequence of events in Germany in 1933 and 1934 illustrates with terrifying clarity how quickly the space for institutional defense can be closed once the closing begins. Third, it means understanding the role of information in political life. The Nazi propaganda machine worked because it was able to manufacture the appearance of inevitability, to create the sense that the movement was unstoppable and that resistance was futile. It worked because it was not adequately countered, not because it could not be countered, but because the institutions that might have countered it were either captured or intimidated. A free press, vigorously exercising its function of investigating and reporting on what power is actually doing, is not a luxury in a democracy. It is a load-bearing wall. When it comes down, everything else becomes more vulnerable. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, it means building the communities of shared democratic commitment that make sustained resistance possible. The individuals who resisted the Nazi regime most effectively did not do so alone. The 94 Social Democrats who voted against the Enabling Act were voting as a bloc in a party that had decided together. The people who had Jewish neighbors were part of networks, church networks, neighborhood networks, political networks that provided mutual support and validation. Resistance is contagious when there is community to catch it. Passivity is also contagious, particularly when the community around you has adopted it. The building of genuine communities of shared democratic values, communities that will reinforce each other's commitment when the costs of commitment rise, is the most important long-term project available to people who care about what happened in Germany and want to ensure it is not repeated. The story of the Nazi rise is not complete. It is not something that happened, was finished, and can be studied with the comfortable distance of genuine pastness. It is a story that is still being processed by historians, by survivors and their descendants, by the countries and cultures that were shaped by it, and by democracies around the world that live in the long shadow it cast. The Holocaust that followed the Nazi seizure of power, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, the industrial-scale atrocity that this channel exists to document and understand, was not separate from the political story we have told in this documentary. It was the direct and traceable consequence of the choices made in Germany between 1919 and 1934. The specific form it took was the product of the specific ideology that the Nazi movement embraced and the specific power it was given. But the underlying conditions, the The desperation, the dehumanization, the institutional failure, the ordinary human compliance are not unique to Germany. They are human conditions. They are conditions that can emerge wherever adequate safeguards are not maintained, wherever the early warning signs are not taken seriously, wherever the prior commitment to democratic values is insufficient to sustain democratic behavior under pressure. We remember the Nazi rise not to frighten ourselves, and not to establish a convenient rhetorical weapon for political arguments about unrelated contemporary situations. We remember it because it is the most thoroughly documented and most consequentially catastrophic example in modern history of what happens when democratic societies fail the test of their most difficult moments. We remember it because the specific mechanisms by which it happened, the economic desperation, the political manipulation, the propaganda, the institutional erosion, the ordinary compliance, are mechanisms we can recognize, understand, and, if we are sufficiently attentive and sufficiently committed, resist. Resist is the right word. Not prevent with certainty. No study of history offers certainty about what will or will not happen in the future. But resist, which is what was possible in Germany in 1930, in 1932, and 1933, and was not done sufficiently, which is what Otto Welles did on March 23, 1933, in the Kroll Opera House, when he stood up in the face of 444 yes votes and delivered his no, which is what the 94 Social Democrats did when they marked their ballots against the act that ended the Republic, which is what every person who refused to participate in the normalization of what was happening, who kept their eyes open, who reported what they saw, who refused to tell themselves that it was probably not as bad as it seemed, chose to do. Those choices did not save Germany. The forces arrayed against them were too great, and too many people who should have joined them did not. But those choices preserved something. They preserved the record. They preserved the testimony. They preserved the knowledge, now available to everyone who will look for it, of what happened, in sufficient detail and with sufficient honesty that no one can claim, any longer, not to know what these mechanisms produce when they are allowed to run unchecked. That knowledge is not a burden to be carried reluctantly. It is a gift, however terrible its origins. It is the specific warning that the 20th century's worst catastrophe offers to everyone who comes after it. This is what it looks like. This is how it starts. This is what people said, and what people ignored, and what people did, and what people refused to do. This is the sequence. These are the mechanisms. This is what is possible when human beings, operating within functioning democratic institutions, fail to take seriously the responsibility that those institutions place on them. The responsibility is not abstract. It is specific. It is the responsibility to vote, and to vote with a genuine understanding of what you are voting for and what you are voting against. It is the responsibility to maintain the free press by reading it, by supporting it, by insisting on accuracy and holding both politicians and journalists to account when accuracy fails. It is the responsibility to defend the independence of the courts by opposing political interference in judicial proceedings regardless of whose political interests the interference serves. It is the responsibility to protect minorities from the specific vulnerabilities that democratic majorities can exploit, because the protection of minorities is not charity. It is the measure of whether a democracy is genuine rather than merely procedural. And it is the responsibility to remember, actively, with the full weight of what remembering requires. To remember not just the Holocaust, the end point, the death camps, the 6 million, but the 14-year political story that preceded it. To remember the Beer Hall Putsch and the trial and Mein Kampf and the Depression and the elections and the backroom deals and the morning of January 30th, 1933. To remember the mechanisms, not just the outcome. To remember that the outcome was not inevitable, that it was the product of choices made by human beings in circumstances that were genuinely difficult, but that did not make those choices inevitable. Different choices were possible. They were not made. Understanding why they were not made, and what kinds of choices and commitments and communities make better choices more likely in the future, is the obligation that the Nazi rise places on everyone who encounters its history. This channel will continue to examine that history in the episodes that follow this one. The story of what happened after January 1933, in Germany, in Europe, in the ghettos and the transit camps and the extermination facilities that the Nazi state built to execute its program, is the subject of this channel's ongoing work. If this documentary has illuminated the foundation for that story, if you understand better than you did before how it came to be that a genocidal movement was given the keys to one of the great nations of the modern world, then it has done what it was designed to do. If it moved you, or troubled you, or made you want to understand more, please consider subscribing. Every subscription is a commitment to staying in contact with this material, not because it is comfortable, but because it is necessary. Leave a comment below and tell us what struck you, what you are thinking about as this episode ends, what questions it opened for you. We read all of them. We learn from them. And the community that forms in those comments, the people who are willing to think seriously and honestly about the worst things that human beings have done and what those things demand of us, is the reason this channel exists. The 94 Social Democrats who voted no on March 23, 1933, are not famous. Most of their names are known only to specialists. But they were right, and they deserve to be remembered, not as heroes in the conventional sense, because what they did was not heroic in the sense of requiring physical courage under enemy fire. It was something quieter and in some ways more demanding. The willingness to say what they believed was true in a room where saying it was costly, knowing that it would not change the outcome of the vote, and doing it anyway. That kind of willingness to speak clearly about what you see, to refuse the manufactured reality, even when the manufactured reality is much more comfortable than the truth, to hold a line even when holding it serves no immediate practical purpose beyond the declaration itself, is not something that only great historical figures possess. It is something that is available to all of us in the smaller rooms and smaller choices of our own lives. It is what remembering the Nazi rise asks of us, and it is what we owe to the people who paid such an incomprehensible price for the failure of enough of their contemporaries to choose it. Until next time, keep seeking the truth. Let us now go deeper into the specific, granular reality of what ordinary German life looked like in those years of the Nazi rise, because the history of great political catastrophes can become abstract in the telling, reduced to statistics and election percentages and the names of politicians, in a way that loses the human texture that makes it comprehensible and relevant. The numbers need faces. The mechanisms need embodiment. Consider the experience of a German family in Leipzig or Cologne or Breslau in 1931. Call them the Schreibers, not a real family, but a representative composite of what the historical record shows ordinary German family life to have looked like in those years. The father, Karl, is a bookkeeper at a medium-sized manufacturing firm. He has worked there for 12 years. He has a pension plan, a modest savings account, a 2-bedroom apartment his family has rented for 8 years, 2 children in school. He voted Social Democrat in 1928 because his father always had, and because the Social Democrats were the party of decent working people who believe that the institution should work for everyone, not just for those who own capital. In October 1930, Karl's firm announces layoffs. He keeps his job, but the friend 2 desks over, Heinrich, with 3 children, does not. Over the following months, Karl watches Heinrich exhaust his unemployment benefits, sell the family's furniture piece by piece, move his family into a single room with relatives. By the summer of 1931, Heinrich is standing in the soup kitchen line 3 streets away, and Karl, passing it on his way to work, feels a specific and terrible combination of relief that it is not him and fear that it might yet be. Karl reads the newspapers. He hears Hitler on the radio. The government has been broadcasting Nazi speeches, and the radio brings the voice into the living room with an immediacy that no newspaper can match. He does not fully believe what Hitler says. The anti-Semitism strikes him as excessive, though he is absorbed enough of the culture's casual prejudice not to be shocked by it. But the core message, that Germany has been betrayed, that the institutions have failed the ordinary person, that something dramatic and different is needed. This Karl feels in his body, because his body is feeling the depression every day. In the July 1932 elections, for the first time in his life, Karl does not vote Social Democrat. He does not vote Nazi, either, not quite yet. He votes for a smaller nationalist party that seems to offer the urgency he needs without the violence he still finds alarming. But he watches his neighbor Hans, who lost his job the previous year and has been wearing a Nazi party badge since January, with something that is not envy, but is not entirely contempt either. Hans seems certain. Hans seems to know who is responsible and what will be done about them. In Karl's world of mounting uncertainty, Hans's certainty looks, some days, less like fanaticism and more like clarity. This is the texture of how radical movements recruit, not primarily through ideology, but through emotional need. Karl Schreiber is not Nazi. He does not particularly like what he has seen and heard of the movement's methods. But he is a man under enormous pressure in a world that has become deeply frightening, and the mainstream political parties, the parties that are supposed to represent people like him, are offering him analysis and programs when what he needs is someone who understands that he is terrified. And here is the thing that the story of Karl Schreiber illuminates about the specific failure of the Weimar Republic's mainstream parties. They did not fail to have good policies. Many of their policies were reasonable, even sophisticated. They failed to speak to the emotional reality of desperate people with enough directness and urgency to maintain their loyalty in the face of a movement that was doing exactly that. Politics is not only policy. It is also the communication of understanding, the demonstration that leaders comprehend what their constituents are experiencing, that they feel the weight of the crisis themselves, that they are moved by the human reality of what is happening and not merely engaged with its technical dimensions. The Social Democrats, in particular, had developed a political culture of careful, analytical, measured response to events that served them well in ordinary times and catastrophically failed them in extraordinary ones. Hitler's genius, again, if genius is the right word for a capacity deployed so catastrophically, was precisely in this dimension. He understood, before almost anyone else in German politics, that political communication in the age of mass media was primarily an emotional transaction. He understood that the voter who was going to support you was not primarily making an analytical judgment about the comparative merits of competing policy platforms. That voter was making an effective judgment. Does this person understand me? Does this movement speak for people like me? Does this leader make me feel that my anger is legitimate and that someone is going to do something about the things that are making my life unbearable? Hitler answered yes to all of these questions with extraordinary force and consistency. And the combination of an audience primed by years of accumulated grievance and a performer whose specific gift was for amplifying and validating exactly those grievances created something that conventional political analysis had no adequate framework for understanding or countering. The German press, or most of it, tried. The Social Democratic press in particular continued to report on Nazi violence, to document SA atrocities, to call attention to the thuggish reality beneath the movement's nationalist romanticism. Journalists like Kurt Tucholsky and Karl von Ossietzky wrote with extraordinary clarity about what the Nazis were and what they intended. Ossietzky was arrested by the Nazi government in 1933 and held in concentration camps. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1936 while still a prisoner, a gesture of international recognition that the Nazi regime greeted with fury. He died in 1938, broken by his imprisonment. The foreign press also reported, with varying degrees of comprehension and alarm. Some foreign correspondents in Berlin understood clearly what was happening and reported it accurately. Others were taken in by the Nazi staging, by the performance of order and efficiency and national purpose that Goebbels' machinery projected to the world. The American newspaper correspondent William Shirer, who was in Berlin throughout the 1930s and who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich 20 years after the war, described the disorienting experience of watching the reality and the performance simultaneously, of knowing, from reporting, what was actually happening behind the facade, while watching the facade successfully deceive sophisticated observers from the outside. The lesson from this is not that truth cannot penetrate propaganda. It is that the penetration of truth through propaganda requires sustained, courageous, specific, factual reporting by people who are willing to follow the evidence where it leads regardless of where that takes them. It requires audiences willing to seek out that reporting rather than the sources that confirm what they already believe. And it requires institutional support for the people doing the reporting, editors and publishers, and, ultimately, societies willing to protect the ability to report unflattering truths about powerful people and powerful movements. When those conditions are present, propaganda fails eventually. The truth that is being buried is too real, involves too many people, produces too many observable consequences, to be indefinitely suppressed. But propaganda can succeed for long enough, particularly when it is operating in an environment where democratic institutions have been undermined or captured, to change the political situation irrevocably. The question is always, does the truth emerge fast enough and reach a wide enough audience before the point of no return is passed? In Germany in the 1930s, it did not. By the time the full reality of the Nazi regime was irrefutably documented and internationally acknowledged, the institutions that might have responded to that knowledge had been dismantled. The democracy was gone. The courts were captured. The press was controlled. The opposition was imprisoned or exiled. The moment when accurate information could have changed political outcomes had passed. This is the terrible specific lesson of the German case. That timing matters. Not just in the abstract sense that early intervention is always easier than late intervention, but in the precise sense that there is a window during which democratic institutions can be defended and after which the defense becomes impossible because the institutions themselves are gone. Identifying that window, recognizing when it is opening, and having the political will and the organizational capacity to act within it rather than after it is closed. These are the specific demands that the Weimar case places on democracies that want to avoid its fate. The people who acted within the window, in Germany, were not ultimately successful. The forces against them were too great, and too many people who should have joined them did not. But their actions were not meaningless. They preserved the record. They demonstrated that resistance was possible and that it was chosen, that the catastrophe was not the inevitable result of impersonal forces, but the outcome of specific human choices that could have been made differently. And that demonstration, preserved in the testimony of survivors and resistors and the careful work of historians, is the most important inheritance that the Weimar period passes to us. Now consider the specific role that fear played in maintaining the Nazi regime once it was established, and how that fear connects to the earlier mechanisms of compliance and institutional erosion. Hannah Arendt's great study of totalitarianism, published in 1951, made a distinction that is important here: the distinction between the fear that operates in an authoritarian government, the specific fear of specific consequences for specific identifiable actions, and the terror that operates in a totalitarian regime. In an authoritarian government, broadly, what you're not allowed to do. You avoid those things, and you're left alone. The fear is real but navigable. In a totalitarian regime, the unpredictability is the point. The terror does not operate through clear rules that can be followed. It operates through the impossibility of knowing which behaviors will attract punishment and which will not, through the constant potential for denunciation, for arbitrary arrest, for consequences that bear no coherent relationship to any specific act. Under these conditions, the safest behavior is total compliance, because any deviation from what the regime appears to want, however ambiguously it has communicated what that is, carries the risk of being the deviation that triggers consequences. The Nazi regime moved toward this totalitarian model with remarkable speed after 1933. The Gestapo, the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police, became the instrument of this terror. Its power was not primarily based on its actual size, which was, in the early years, surprisingly modest relative to the population it was supposed to police. Its power was based on the network of informants that supplemented its professional staff, and on the knowledge, pervasive across German society, that informants were everywhere, that a careless comment to a neighbor or a colleague could result in arrest, that the private sphere had become permeable to state surveillance in ways that made genuine opposition extraordinarily dangerous. People told themselves they were safe if they kept their heads down. Mostly they were right. But the knowledge that they might not be, that the system was unpredictable enough that safety was never guaranteed, produced a self-censorship and a self-regulation that was, in practice, more effective than any active policing could have been. People did not need to be arrested to be controlled. The possibility of arrest was sufficient. This is what makes the early stage of democratic erosion so critical. Before the mechanisms of totalitarian terror are in place, resistance is genuinely possible at manageable cost. Once those mechanisms are established, once the Gestapo is operational, once informants are embedded in every workplace and neighborhood, once the consequences of being caught in opposition are severe enough to make the risk calculation clearly negative, the cost of resistance rises to a level that only the exceptional will pay. The window for effective, organized, democratic resistance had closed in Germany by the summer of 1933. After that, what remained was individual heroism at enormous personal cost, and the underground networks of the diminishing resistance. Important, morally necessary, preserving something of a human record, but not capable of reversing what had happened. The window closes, and it closes faster than people expect, and more completely than they believe possible, when they're inside the process watching it happen day by day. The incremental nature of the erosion means that no single day provides the clear threshold that would trigger the response that might have stopped it. Each step is a little worse than the one before. Each step is, individually, met with the calculation that this particular step is probably not the one that requires everything to be risked. By the time the cumulative effect is undeniable, the capacity for organized response has been sufficiently degraded that the response cannot be effective. This is why the most important question for any democratic society that cares about what happened in Germany is not, what would we do if our democracy were in the kind of danger that Germany faced in 1933? Because by 1933, in Germany, the answer to that question was already determined by everything that had happened in the years before. The important question is, what are we doing now, in the ordinary moments before crisis, to build the resilience, institutional, social, cultural, that makes democratic systems capable of withstanding the specific pressures that can destroy them? That question does not have a single answer. It has many partial answers, each important, none sufficient alone. Strong and genuinely independent judicial institutions, a free press that is supported economically and legally and culturally by the society it serves, an informed citizenry that understands its own political system well enough to recognize when that system is being abused, political leaders who model democratic norms through their own behavior, and who are willing to hold those norms even when violating them would serve their short-term interests. Civil society organizations, unions, religious institutions, professional associations, advocacy groups that provide the community and the organizational capacity for collective action when collective action is needed, and the specific, unglamorous, constantly renewed work of political participation, voting, organizing, running for office, holding officials accountable, supporting the institutions, and the people who support the institutions. None of this is exciting. Most of it is unglamorous. All of it is necessary. The Beer Hall Putsch is exciting. The Night of the Long Knives is dramatic. The torchlit processions through the Brandenburg Gate are cinematically compelling. The work of maintaining democratic societies is none of those things. It is the work of showing up, of paying attention, of insisting on standards when it would be more convenient to let them slide, of taking seriously the obligations that citizenship entails even when taking them seriously is costly. That work is the final lesson of the Nazi rise. Not that catastrophe is inevitable when democracy comes under pressure. Not that human beings are incapable of the courage and the clarity required to resist, but that the resistance must be built before it is needed, in the ordinary moments, through the ordinary choices, by the ordinary people who constitute democratic societies. The Nazi rise happened because enough of those people made choices in those ordinary moments that cleared the path for something extraordinary and terrible. The prevention of the next version of this story, whatever form it takes and whatever country it emerges, depends on different choices being made by enough people in enough ordinary moments before the extraordinary and terrible arrives to make clear what was at stake all along. Remember that, and come back to this channel, where we will continue to examine these histories, not from a safe distance, but with the full honesty that the weight of what happened demands. Until next time, keep watching, keep asking, keep seeking the truth, and refusing to be satisfied with less. There is one more dimension of this story that deserves explicit attention, because it is the dimension that connects most directly to the specific mission of this channel: the role of anti-Semitism in the Nazi movement and its relationship to what followed. It is possible to tell the story of the Nazi rise to power, as this documentary has largely done, focusing primarily on the economic crisis, the political failures, the propaganda machinery, the institutional erosion, the establishment's miscalculations. All of these are real and important elements of the story. But they are incomplete without full acknowledgement of the centrality of anti-Semitism to the Nazi movement's ideology and to the specific catastrophe that followed the Nazi seizure of power. The anti-Semitism was not a side element. It was not a rhetorical device used primarily to attract voters and intended to be moderated in practice. It was the organizing principle of the entire worldview that Hitler and his movement embraced. The Jews, in Nazi ideology, were the primary enemy of the German people and of all human civilization. Everything else, the stab in the back, the Versailles humiliation, the economic crisis, the Marxist threat, the decadence of Weimar culture, was, in the Nazi framework, ultimately the work of Jewish hands, destroying Jewish power, removing Jews from German life, and ultimately eliminating the Jewish threat to humanity. These were not subordinate goals that might be sacrificed to other considerations. They were the point. This is stated plainly in Mein Kampf. Hitler wrote about Jews as a biological threat, as a race of parasites that infected host nations and had to be removed for the health of those nations to be restored. He wrote about this with a consistency and a totality that left no room for the interpretation that he was speaking metaphorically or that he would moderate his position once in power. He was not speaking metaphorically. He did not moderate his position. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others across occupied Europe, was not an accidental byproduct of the Nazi regime. It was the most direct possible execution of the program that Hitler had been announcing since 1920. The German voters who marked their ballots for the NSDAP between 1930 and 1932 were, in most cases, not voting specifically for the Holocaust. They were voting against economic despair, against political dysfunction, against the accumulated humiliations of the post-war years. But they were voting for a movement that had announced its intentions clearly, that had been consistent in those announcements for more than a decade, and that would, when given power, proceed with those intentions at maximum speed. The relationship between what they voted for and what happened after is the most disturbing truth of the Nazi period, and it cannot be adequately addressed by emphasizing the economic and political factors while minimizing the ideological core. The anti-Semitism that drove the Holocaust was not unique to Germany. It had deep roots across European Christian civilization, centuries of scapegoating and persecution and exclusion that had made Jews a convenient target whenever a society needed someone to blame. The specific form it took in Nazi Germany, the racial pseudoscience, the biological framework, the eliminationist logic, had been developing in the European intellectual tradition since the mid-19th century, and had been expressed by multiple German thinkers before Hitler appropriated and radicalized their ideas. Hitler did not invent German anti-Semitism. He weaponized it. He gave it state power. He transformed a cultural prejudice into a government program, and the program proceeded with the full resources of a modern state behind it. understanding that the Holocaust grew directly from the specific ideology of the movement that is examined in this documentary, not as an unexpected development, but as the most predictable possible consequence of giving power to people who had announced their intentions in advance, is essential to understanding both the Nazi rise and the Holocaust itself. The two parts of the story are inseparable. You cannot understand how the Holocaust happened without understanding how the Nazis came to power. And you cannot understand the full meaning of the Nazi rise to power without understanding where it was always going. That is why this channel devotes itself to both stories. The political story of how the Nazi regime was built, and the human story of what that regime did with the power it built. They are not two separate topics joined by historical accident. They are one continuous story about what happens when hatred is given the apparatus of a state and the resources of an industrial civilization, and about what that should teach us about the specific kinds of hatred we must refuse to normalize in the political lives of our own societies. The normalization of anti-Semitism in Weimar Germany was not a sudden event. It was the cumulative result of decades of cultural anti-Semitism, jokes, stereotypes, casual exclusions, the assumption that Jewish people were somehow fundamentally different and somewhat less German than their non-Jewish neighbors, that had been embedded in German culture long before the Nazis arrived to exploit it. The Nazis exploited it because it was available to be exploited. They radicalized it because radicalization was possible in a culture that had never decisively rejected the underlying prejudice. This is the thread that connects the political history of the Nazi rise to the documentary work this channel will continue doing in episodes to come. The stories we will examine, of the ghettos, of the camps, of the specific human experiences of people who were targeted, deported, and murdered, are the stories of where this political story led. They are not separate. They are the same story, extended to its conclusion. Remember this connection. It matters. The Holocaust was not a natural disaster that struck Germany in the 1940s. It was the deliberate, planned, systematically executed consequence of political choices made in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. Choices that were visible, choices that were contested, choices that could have been made differently. It was the consequence of hatred that was allowed to grow until it had state power behind it. And the prevention of future atrocities of this kind requires, among other things, the refusal to allow hatred to grow unchallenged in democratic societies. The insistence, made at cost if necessary, that the dehumanization of any group of people is unacceptable, regardless of how convenient that dehumanization might be to someone's political project. That refusal, sustained across time and across ordinary moments, is the final thing this documentary asks of you. Not heroism, not sacrifice, just the ongoing, daily, unglamorous commitment to seeing other human beings as fully human, and to refusing, however quietly, however modestly, in whatever arena is available to you, to participate in the systematic denial of that humanity when you encounter it. It is enough. It is more than enough. It is, in fact, everything. If you have watched this documentary to the end, you have done something important. You have committed the time and the attention required to understand, seriously, one of the most consequential political sequences in modern history. That understanding is not complete. No single documentary could make it complete, but it is a foundation, and what you build on that foundation, the further reading, the continued engagement with this history, the way you bring what you have learned to bear on the political life of your own time, is entirely in your hands. If this documentary has contributed to your understanding of how the Nazis came to power, and why that question matters as much today as it did when the Weimar Republic existed, please subscribe to this channel and leave a comment below. Tell us what struck you most. Tell us what questions this has opened for you. Tell us what part of this history you want to explore further, because this channel exists to explore all of it. The rise, the regime, the Holocaust, the liberation, the reckoning, with the same seriousness and the same refusal to look away. The history demands it. The dead demand it. And the living, all of us, navigating the political world that this history helped shape, deserve it. Until next time, keep watching, keep seeking, keep remembering.